This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, looking at these markets here, a little bit mixed here. We've got the S&P off 0.75%. The Dow is actually up 16 points there. NASDAQ still trending lower, down 1.8%. The Russell kind of hanging in there as well, down only 0.3%. Yields higher here. 10-year Treasury up at 6 basis points, 3.94%. WTI crude oil, it is a little bit lower here, $71.50 a barrel. It was up over $73 earlier, so it's pulled back. And Bitcoin up 3.9%, 45,300. How about that for Tom Keene? With our news in New York City, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul. And Mike, the death toll has now climbed to at least 48 after a magnitude 7.6 earthquake struck Japan. The quake hit off the Noto Peninsula on Japan's northwest coast. This man, a Tokyo resident and U.S. national, was visiting Toyama when the quake hit.
First, it just started very slowly, and everybody kind of left it off. You know, they thought, oh, this is kind of humorous, you know, on New Year's Day, and then it's just a violent shake.
The tremor was followed by hundreds of aftershocks. Israel's Supreme Court overturned a highly contested law aimed at weakening the justice's own power in a loss to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's right-wing coalition. The court struck down a law passed by Parliament in July that would have barred judges from voiding government decisions as unreasonable. We get more from Bloomberg's Elisa Odenheimer.
The government law that was enacted in July had spurred all kinds of demonstrations, hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating week after week against it, mainly led by the left wing. Now, you know, Israel's quite split down the middle between right and left wing, and the left wing protested against it quite a bit because they felt that it would give the government too much power.
Bloomberg's Elisa Odenheimer. A Japan Airlines plane caught fire on the runway of Tokyo's Haneda Airport. All passengers and crew were evacuated on the passenger plane that apparently collided with a plane operated by the Japanese Coast Guard. The Coast Guard said, though, 5 crew members on its plane were killed. Someone in Michigan is a whole lot richer today. A winning Powerball lottery ticket worth about $842 million was sold at a Food Castle grocery store in Grand Blanc, about 60 miles north of Detroit. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Paul, Mike.
All right, Michael Barr, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Michael Regan, here's a story that got my attention as a former media analyst. It's getting a lot harder for streaming services to hold on to their customers. About 1/4 of U.S. subscribers to major streaming services, a group that includes Apple Plus TV, Discovery Plus, Disney Plus, Hulu, Max, Netflix, Paramount Plus, Peacock, and Starz. About 1/4 of those have canceled at least 3 of them over the past 2 years. That's according to November data from subscription analytics provider Antenna. 2 years ago, the number stood at 15%, a sign that streaming users are becoming increasingly fickle.
Yeah, I love the quote from the one woman quoted in the story. She said, with the streaming services increasing their rates like they are, it's like, okay, do I pay for cable now?
Yep.
We're going back to the old days. But
yeah, it looks like, you know, at some point, you know, you look at, you know, your credit card bill and you got all these charges hitting. You're like, boy, if I just kind of wrap them up, couldn't somebody just wrap them up for me and sell me a bundle of this stuff? And
yeah, and let you flip
John
through
Willow
it too.
did that 40 years ago with the cable industry.
and you can flip through it. Now you have to go and wait for the other one to boot up. But you know what keeps me sucked in, Paul, is I've been watching a lot of soccer in recent years. Okay. And for soccer, like Premier League in England, you need the Peacock service. For the MLS in the U.S., you need Apple Plus. Paramount's got some of the others. ESPN Plus has some of the others. So get me one soccer streaming service.
And if you're an investor in some of these media companies, you're really at a loss here because most of them, with the notable exception of Netflix, don't make money with their streaming businesses. They lose money, billions of dollars.
Something's got to give, right?
Something's got to give. And a lot of folks feel like there might be some consolidation in the media industry to get some of these smaller media companies together to pull their streaming assets. So we'll see how that plays out. I, for one, we should have just stuck with the cable. That was a perfectly good model. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
Why were the economists so wrong? What are the economists getting wrong?
Isn't this a slam dunk time to buy U.S. Treasuries?
Soft landing, hard landing, no landing. I don't know.
True. What the heck does that mean?
I don't know.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
We're going to be in an environment with higher rates for longer.
The 5-day in-office work week is effectively dead.
It's definitely a good sign that we're not ready to land this economy just yet.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to talk about the global automobile industry, particularly the EV business. There's some recent reporting out that BYD, the Chinese EV manufacturer, surpassing Tesla as the leading EV automaker. So we're going to get the latest on that. I think Rivian also had some delivery data that missed estimates. So we'll get all the latest on the electric vehicle business. Then Phil Tays, CEO of Tays Asset Management, he's going to join us with his market call. That's all coming up in this hour. Let's kick things off, though, with one, Charlie Bell.
Hi, thank you very much. And here's what's going on, Paul Sweeney. We've got the Dow higher, S&P, NASDAQ. They are both trading lower right now. First trading session of the brand new year with the S&P down 33 points at 47.36, a drop there of 0.7%. NASDAQ down 257, down 1.7%. But the Dow Jones Industrial Average keeps on going, up another 15, up by less than 0.1%. Green on the screen, a record for the Dow. We've got the Russell 2000 index of small cap shares trading lower by 0.5%. 10-year yield right now, 3.94%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.33%. Spot gold down $3 the ounce to $2,059, drop there of just about 0.1%. Bitcoin certainly getting our attention today, up 3.6% with a 45,000 handle on Bitcoin, 45,219 right now on Bitcoin. West Texas Intermediate crude lower, little change right now, down 2 cents, 71.63 a barrel. So it is a mixed Tuesday. As for the overall market backdrop and valuations, Sarah Hunt is Chief Market Strategist at Alpine Saxon Woods.
I think having money have a cost makes valuations matter in a way that we had 15 years where, people talked about it, but it didn't really matter. Maybe that starts to happen now, and maybe people really start looking at those metrics. But I think you've got a lot of money on the table. You've got a lot of places that, got a lot of money that needs to be invested.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. A downgrade for Apple at Barclays over soft demand for its latest iPhone. Barclay analysts cut their rating on Apple to underweight with a price target of $160. Right now, Apple is trading at $186.30. It is down now by 3.3%. Again, recapping mixed Tuesday here with the Dow higher by 9, little changed, S&P down 0.7%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. As always, Mike Regan, Paul Sweeney, we're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. We're also streaming live on YouTube, so head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radio. Boy, the NASDAQ off 1.7% here. I look at it, who the movers are. Apple, Microsoft, NVIDIA, Amazon, Meta, all contributing to the decline there. Let's break it down here with Abigail Doolittle. She joins us live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. So tough day for the tech stocks out there, Abigail.
Yeah, very tough day. That NASDAQ 100, as you were mentioning, down 1.7%. Its worst day at one point since the end of October. That may be the case actually right now. And the big decliners, Charlie was talking about that downgrade at Barclays of Apple to underweight a new price target of 160 on channel checks, supporting the idea that demand for...
I just laugh at it downgrade. I mean, I'm sure the person did their great analysis here, but it's just, you look at the long-term chart of Apple, and it's like, why fight that? I mean, just own it.
Well, you know what? So I'll fight you on that call because I'll pull up the chart of Apple. And so any chart, there is a beautiful uptrend. But Apple's Apple, I wouldn't be surprised. I would be very surprised if it doesn't go back down toward last year's low of around 166. And if you pull up a maximum chart, which is going to take a moment from my Bloomberg. So to your point, yes, it's a beautiful uptrend. It's a steep uptrend. And typically these types of uptrends need to consolidate. So when I pull up the the longer term chart, it's basically we're looking at consolidation that would be super healthy, probably around that 165, or you could also make the case truthfully for 140. That would be a more yes, you can make that case for sure. And there's also the possibility of some sort of a topping pattern there, not a true double top, in the fact that the second top is a little bit higher. Typically you'd want to see it lower because that would suggest the buyers are less enthusiastic. But I think that his point is that the iPhone, that 15, there's not enough new bells and whistles on it to really entice folks to buy a new iPhone, you know, shell out $1,000 on it, or the iPhone 16. Service is not expected to grow more than 10%, so the diversification's not happening. You know, truthfully, I think that what that analyst is doing, and I think his name is Tim Long, this is typically a quiet day, a day that there's not going to be a lot of news. So he's taking advantage of that, and he's getting a big bang for his buck because this stock.
Talking about it.
Yes, we're talking about it.
I didn't upgrade the phone because you have to get the new charging thing. I'm not doing the new.
Doesn't that come with the phone?
Yeah, but I've got charging cords all over my house and
got
all
it.
my
So
vehicles.
To really buy
and so
all
now
the
you
new
got to
ones.
configure your whole charging environment. I'm not doing
That's interesting.
that. Yeah.
Well, I have the iPhone 14, so I wasn't going to do it either. And I typically, but you know, moving back to the declines in technology, what makes it so interesting, so to your point, the worst stocks from a point drag basis, Apple down 3.2%, Microsoft down 1.9%, NVIDIA down 3.3%, Meta down 3.4%, Amazon down 1.9%, Google, AMD, Intel, Broadcom, Adobe, CRM, Netflix, Intuit, like that's the S&P 500. So last year, these were the hot stocks. So now some folks, maybe whether they're taking profits, you have yields higher on the day, that's a little bit of a pressure in terms of valuation. But it looks like some portfolios are being reconfigured a little bit. And something I want to do, because this was such a reliable indicator last year, if we were having this conversation at this time last year, the sky was falling. I think stocks were actually slightly higher. The Santa Claus rally was in effect by a small margin, but last year had been so difficult. Everybody thought this was last year, 2023 was going to be the year of recession. Right now, I believe we are not looking at a Santa Claus rally for the S&P 500. I'm pulling it up. Yes, in fact, we're down 0.2%. This is actually a pretty reliable indicator of how the year goes. That said, it's a presidential year. Stocks tend to perform well. Maybe it's going to be a volatile year, where in the beginning of the year we have some volatility. And one reason to think this, the Bloomberg Dollar Index right now up by 0.6%. Its best day since either the beginning of September or the beginning of October. It looks like we're going to see a technically driven rally back up, maybe by 4%. If that happens, that could pressure risk assets in a big way, because of course they're denominated in dollars, and could also give a tailwind to yields.
Trying to remember the old Santa Claus rhyme. What was it? If Santa doesn't come to Broaden Wall or something like that?
I've never heard that. Try to recall it. That sounds good.
Yeah, but that is something people really pay close attention to, that January barometer, right?
Yes.
We're talking with Gina Martin-Adams a little bit about it. A strong or a weak start to January very often does signal what's to come, right?
And last year it was really interesting because there's the Santa Claus rally, the January barometer, and then there's something I think in February. And whenever all three come into play, that's when you have the biggest rally. And lo and behold, last year, even though expectations and sentiment was so poor coming into the year and really for the first quarter, all three of those came into play, and the NASDAQ 100 was up more than 55%, its best year since 1999. So now there seems to be a little bit of a cooling of those animal spirits. Certainly one day a trend does not make. I mean, if you recall at the beginning of, was it 2022, we came in out of 2020 and 2021 with the big rally. I think the first day of 2022 was up, and then we just kind of sank into an ugly year.
Yep, that was an ugly year for equities and bonds. Really no place to hide there in 2022. Abigail Doolittle, thank you so much for joining us. Abigail Doolittle covers all the markets for us. We appreciate getting a few minutes of her time. We got some delivery data just recently for some of the electric vehicle companies, kind of Tesla, Rivian, all that type of stuff. Let's get the latest here from Steve Mann. He's a global auto market research leader for Bloomberg Intelligence. He's zooming in from our Princeton campus down there in Princeton, New Jersey. Steve, let's start with Tesla here. The numbers kind of in line with expectation, but I know the news headline is Tesla falls behind BYD in quarterly EV sales. You spent many years in Hong Kong leading our Bloomberg Intelligence effort there, so you had firsthand look at the growth and development of the Chinese electric vehicle market. Tell us what's happening with, well, first of all, who is BYD and how do they compete against Tesla?
Well, yeah, that's right, Paul. BYD, fourth quarter EV sales came in about 8% above Tesla's on a global level. So it's pretty significant. It's the first time ever that BYD beat Tesla. Well, BYD is Warren Buffett back electric vehicle manufacturer. They're very vertically integrated. They've launched a slew of cheaper, less expensive models in the China market. So that's probably driven a lot of the sales in the fourth quarter on the back of weaker macroeconomic conditions. So they've done well. BYD's done well.
And yet, Steve, we don't see any BYD vehicles in the U.S. Correct me if I'm wrong about that, at least passenger vehicles. I wonder why that is. Is it tariffs or trade war issues? Is it just a business decision on their part?
Oh, it's a combination of all that. I think more importantly, BYD just doesn't have, the distribution network like the big three and some of the European companies have here in the U.S. So it's really hard for them to establish themselves, to really build the brand in the U.S. So on top of all the stuff you just talked about, their focus is really not in the U.S. though. They are getting into Europe. They're planning to build a plant in Hungary in 2026. It's a low-cost producing manufacturing country, so they want to kind of break into the European market first, then think about the U.S. So we were talking about the EV sales crown. I think it's going to be flip-flopping between Tesla and BYD in the next year, maybe into 2025, until BYD has a plant in Europe. That's when they move out of their local comfort zone, local market in China, and expand overseas. And that's probably when they're gonna, if BYD continue to do well, that's probably when they're gonna solidify the lead for global EV sales.
Interesting. I'm looking at an interesting article on the Bloomberg Terminal today from Bloomberg News. Electric car models eligible for $7,500 tax credit cut to 13 from almost 24. The new list excludes vehicles that use certain Chinese-made parts. That can't be good for EV sales in the United States.
No, it's interesting because the Inflation Reduction Act was supposed to generate or supposed to increase EV sales in the U.S., but it's kind of counterintuitive. But I think that's only temporary because what the IRA really is trying to do is get U.S. to build a battery supply chain locally here in the U.S. so that battery prices come down, EVs becomes more affordable for the U.S. consumer. So if you look at all the investment that's been made so far on battery plants, a lot of those will actually come online in 2025, 2026. That's going to make U.S. battery production a lot more competitive and probably able to produce batteries below what the Chinese are producing at. So we think that's right. We think EV sales will probably take a break in the next couple of years until more models come in place with cheaper batteries, and hopefully the mindset of the U.S. consumer changes a bit, and they become more warmed up to EVs, and hopefully demand will improve 2025 and beyond.
Steve, I rode over the weekend in a Rivian for the first time. My buddy finally got delivery of a Rivian. I don't know when he ordered it. I think it was like 5 years ago. I got to say, it's an impressive car. I mean, I'm no Matt Miller as far as reviewing automobiles, but I was impressed. But then I read today, Steve, that Rivian stock is really taking a beating today because their deliveries in the fourth quarter missed estimates. Now, I know it's a very expensive vehicle. I wonder if that's part of the problem, or is it execution? Is it still supply chain issues? What's going on with Rivian that they're missing estimates?
Yeah, I think it's down 10% today, and it's more of an operational issue. I think a few weeks ago, there was an announcement that AT&T was going to buy the Rivian trucks, and I think everybody got excited. The stock surged quite a bit. I think that's because people thought the break even is actually sooner than later. Right now, Rivian actually loses on every car that they built. So now that they're they really didn't really miss. They kind of hit consensus expectation, but I think consensus the street was expecting a lot higher number, a beat. So the thinking is maybe the break even point is not going to be 2024 or 2025, probably in 2026. So the concern is, how are they going to make it through between now and then?
Yeah, these are $100,000 cars too, right? Yeah. No room to cut prices. I guess.
Matt Miller was able to arrange a week-long test for me of the F-150 Lightning, which was an awesome vehicle. And I'm not an EV person. I'm certainly not a truck person. I'm a Wall Street person.
Miller's just farming out vehicles.
He is. But the sticker on this thing was $94,000. I was like, holy cow, that's just a serious thing. So, all right, Steve, more Tesla news. Their deliveries were pretty much in line with estimates. Is that a good performance for Tesla here?
Well, they did revise their guidance.
They did revise their guidance.
Yes, I think Elon Musk at the beginning of 2023 was talking about 2 million unit number. They had a bunch of price cuts to drum up demand, and they ended up at 1.8. It's probably going to be a slower growth, like I said earlier, in the next couple of years. We think, Tesla maybe can able to do 2.1, especially with, the price cuts the series of price cuts that they made in 2023 and maybe Cybertruck coming online. Hopefully, they can get that going quickly, get that, new battery plant going quickly and hit that 2.1. But there is a risk in terms of earnings. It's a tall order for Tesla. It's a balancing act. They want to continue to pump the Model 3 and Model Y out, get sales up because that's a cash cow for them. But at the same time, they're going to manage ramping up Cybertruck and the next model that they want to introduce, which is a compact. It's dubbed the Model 2. It's a compact vehicle. So there's a lot of things they're going to manage in 2024, and I think there is some risk to consensus earnings.
All right, Steve Mann, thanks so much for joining us. Steve Mann, he's a global auto market research leader for Bloomberg Intelligence, based now in Princeton, New Jersey, after managing Bloomberg Intelligence in Hong Kong for many years. Appreciating getting a couple minutes of his time. I haven't seen the Cybertruck on the road yet.
I was just thinking the same. I haven't seen one either. Yeah. I don't know. There haven't been a ton sold yet, but they're getting a lot of deliveries from it.
I can't wait to see one because it's just such a unique, novel look. Like there's nothing like it on the road.
Yeah, and I hear you do not want to run into one of them. You will lose in an accident versus that.
Well, I mean, it's bulletproof, right?
Right.
So I mean, what are they? This is tight. I mean, what did they make this?
I guess it's all steel. We should have asked Steve, but I'm not going to find out the hard.
I'm sure Matt Miller's going to pull up in one of these things up in the 731 Lexington Avenue, showcasing it for everyone. So we'll see about that. S&P 500 off 0.6%. This is Bloomberg. To get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
Hey there, Paul. Airbus, it managed to beat its annual delivery target in 2023. Now, according to Aviation Flights Group, the world's largest maker of commercial aircraft, likely handed over 733 planes to customers last year, more than its goal of 720 deliveries. Now, the company reached near record output in the final month of the year. Airbus ADRs right now, they're up about 0.2%. Evercore has downgraded Southwest to inline from outperform after a big rally into year-end. Bloomberg's Simone Foxman has more on that.
Dwayne Fenningworth at Evercore ISI, maintaining his $35 price target, still about 21% higher than Friday's close for this name, but saying margins really below their long-term potential and Southwest growth not keeping up with the overall growth in the U.S. economy.
Southwest is down about 0.6%. Airline stocks were among the winners in 2023. The S&P Super Composite Airlines Industry Index, it rose nearly 6.5%. Now, it was a first annual gain since before the pandemic. SkyWest shares, that led the index. Their price more than doubled. And shares of Allegiant Travel and Delta Airlines, they both rose 20%. Allegiant Travel right now down about 2%. Delta Airlines down just a fraction. And speaking of Delta, its more than 2-year-long pilot hiring spree is starting to slow. The Wall Street Journal says the carrier plans to hire about half as many pilots next year as it did in 2023. In a memo, Southwest said it plans to bring on about 1,100 pilots next year, which is higher than a typical year, but not as much as in recent years. Delta said it still sees 2024 as a strong travel period, but more normalized. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. I'm Charlie Pellet. Stocks in the red. First trading day of the brand new trading year. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index all lower. Dow right now down 15 points, giving up earlier gains. Little change, but still down less than 1/10%. Coming off of a record there, we have got NASDAQ down 225 points, a drop of 1.5%. S&P 500 down 31, drop there of 0.6%. Dow transports down now by 0.7%. We've got the 10-year yielding 3.92%, with a 2-year right now 4.31%. Spot gold higher, little changed, up less than 0.2%, up $3 the ounce to $2,066. Cannot ignore Bitcoin today. Bitcoin surging 3.1%, 44,991, back below 45,000. Bitcoin though again up 3.1%. Gold, as I mentioned, up 0.2%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.1%, 70.83 a barrel on WTI. We were just talking about those EV makers. Tesla delivered more vehicles than expected in the fourth quarter. Tesla shares today, they're up 0.5%. Rival Rivian lower now by 9.8%. And among other EV makers, Lucid up by 0.6%. Again, recapping, stocks lower, S&P down 30, drop there of 0.6%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Michael Regan, Paul Sweeney. We're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube, so head over there if you like, youtube.com, and search Bloomberg Radio. Mike, if you were a fund manager and you weren't all in on the fourth quarter, there's no way you could perform last year.
You have a hard time writing that letter to investors at the end of last year, I think.
Exactly right. Let's check in with somebody who does do this stuff for a living. Phil Tays, he's the CEO of Tays Asset Management. And Phil, thanks for joining us here in our studio here. I believe the last time we chatted with you, you had over 90% of your assets in cash. Hopefully you weren't that positioned in the fourth quarter.
And thankfully we were not.
Okay.
So we have run a pretty tight trend following algorithm across our different asset classes.
A trend following algorithm.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
That's some multi-syllabic stuff for you there. But we came back into the markets early in the fourth quarter, and we're there for the rest of the year. I mean, you remember that downturn we had last year? looked like it was going to turn into something. It didn't, and yeah, thankfully, most people, if they were invested at least, had a great fourth quarter.
Yeah, Phil, I was cracking up reading your notes to us earlier today. You say the key insight for the year is to adopt a George Costanza perspective.
Exactly. So I guess there are probably listeners that don't know who George Costanza is, but on Seinfeld, he made such ubiquitously bad decisions. He decided the best way to lead his life was to do the opposite of what his judgment told him.
Right.
And I think if you look back over the last really 4 years now, you just see that markets were inexplicable. Like in 2020 and 2021, pre-vaccine, right, markets were soaring after a downturn, of course, in 2020. And really almost no one could have predicted that. Then again in 2022, we thought markets were going to do okay, despite the fact that we thought inflation was going to be transitory, yields wouldn't go higher, markets got hit very hard. And how many people were predicting a really great market in 2023? Not many. And in fact, if you look at Forbes' collection of Wall Street strategists, that was one of the first times they were ever negative, thinking they would have a 5% loss in 2023. Of course, that obviously didn't happen. So let's just do the opposite of what our best judgment tells us for 2024.
What are your thoughts here as we start the new year?
Okay, so our approach is different than many. In other words, we don't want to be firmly directional for the year. We don't think that's wise for reasons I just talked about. It's almost impossible to predict the markets. So what we embrace is an approach we call a behavioral portfolio. It's an all-seasons approach that does two things. It attempts to allow you to be in core asset classes like stocks and bonds, but do it in a way that addresses contingencies. In my notes that I wrote, I said Gene Fama's a smart guy, but what investors want is not the very best performance. They want to be in the markets but not get blown to pieces. So for equities, take half of your equities, put it into hedged equities so that if markets turn down, you're going to have some potentially offsetting appreciation in some things. For fixed income, be adaptive. Like have an unconstrained fund that can be in different parts of the market, T-bills, high-yield bonds, investment grade.
When you look at some of the indexes of trend following as a strategy, I look at the CTA ETF as one example, Managed Futures ETF, yes. The DB Cross Asset CT Index. They had really great 2022s when the stock market was down and the bond market was down. From these indexes, not such a good 2023. When you would think, the equity market seemed to just go in one direction last year. Is there sort of a bias to being short in trend following that you do better when you're on the short side when the market's going down?
Well, so I think you have to be careful what you look at. So if you're looking at CTAs, often they're investing in trend following and futures contracts that are not necessarily the stock market.
Yeah.
Right. And so you want to focus on something that's more of a pure hedged equity play. But right. So often hedged equity strategies will trail during a rise market. And I think that's why this combined approach of being hedged equities for half of your equities, just conventional stuff for the other half of your equities, on average, if you would have done that, you still would have probably been up, nicely double digits, maybe a little over 20%, not all the way with the market, but you would have been there for the markets.
So how much cash do you have now, or are you essentially fully invested?
Zero cash. So when we went long,
okay.
Now I say that with one caveat. In some of our unconstrained bond strategies, we do have some T-bill exposure presently, but across all of our equity strategies and everything else, we're fully allocated.
So in fixed income, fixed income actually had positive returns in 2023 after disastrous 2022.
Right.
What do you think here? Am I in fixed income? Do I go take credit risk? How do you guys look at that?
Yeah, so I think the mistake that many people are still making is they're looking at how great T-bills were in 2022 and the first part of 2023 and saying that's our bet. Or we're going to go to CDs or fixed annuities or something like that that'll earn a 5% rate. That's the wrong trade. And the reason it's the wrong trade is if you look at the history of investment grade bonds and high yield bonds during a time when the Fed is easing, there have been historically great returns, ranging up as high as 50% sometimes. So this idea that 5% is the best thing anymore has to vanish. So we look at a couple of scenarios. You look at soft landing, hard landing, no landing, as long as inflation is not resurgent, right? As long as that key measure stays low, I think bonds do pretty decently. And then that one contingency, which I do think you have to address, the possibility that inflation comes higher, that could put bonds underwater again. So you need to be, that's why I say agile and unconstrained with your bond approach.
So when you go heavy into cash, it's more a reflection of what you expect the stock or bond markets to do. It's not that yield you're getting on cash in a money market fund or wherever, or T-bills that is influencing the decision.
Exactly. We're just going defensive. We're not making a prediction. We're just reacting to what's happened to the markets, but we're just going defensive.
So when I looked at the fixed income returns for 2023, I was really surprised to see that the real money was made in high yield, kind of a 13, 14% total return. And that's in the midst of everybody every day talking about a recession where I would think you wouldn't want to take credit risk. Why did high yield do so well last year?
Well, I think it's just a function of a couple of things. One of the main things is that, earlier in 2023, high yield bonds were yielding close to 9%. Right, so if that's your starting place before you have any appreciation, that potentially looks very good. And then the fact that we had this strong fourth quarter and high yield bonds rallied a lot in the fourth quarter. So what you were talking about earlier is a big part of what happened.
And Phil, in true Costanza fashion, it looks like you've invented your own holiday here, the National Investment Risks Day. What's that all about?
Yeah, so someone on my staff created this on my birthday, January the 19th, and it's actually registered with the National Archives. It is a holiday. You can find it.
It's the Festivus for investors?
And we used to have a no acronym policy, but now we've called it Nerd Day, NIRD. But here's the thing, is like we continually watch these investments that are super horrible ideas become very popular and then maybe have trillions of dollars of net worth. And what's so fascinating is that often the biggest financial institutions in the world get on board. And so what we're trying to do each year is look at things that are like that, things that are absolutely crazy. What are the most insane ideas that happened in 2023? We have an esteemed staff like the behavioral economist Dan Crosby, Brian Portnoy, and I think even a Bloomberg columnist is coming on to oversee the webinar. So we're looking forward to that on the 19th of Jan.
In 2024, what are you going to stay? What are you staying away from here? Is there something here? I don't know if it's geopolitical risk that's causing you to shy away from something. What are you staying away from, do you think, at this early stage?
Well, at the moment, it's cash.
Okay.
At the moment, you just stay away from T-bills because I think that's the losing trade. Now, I say that understanding that things can adapt very quickly. I mean, we're seeing clearly we have really strong sentiment, and sentiment indicators kind of off the charts coming into the end of the year. So just that alone would say that we could have a downturn here. I don't know how big it could be, but I just think, if you already missed 2023, if you were in cash and you didn't experience what we had in the fourth quarter, but also the rest of the year, that doesn't bode well for what may happen in 2024 if you stay in cash right now.
Yeah. Well, Phil, and quickly, we only have about a minute left, but a lot of people poo-poo crypto and Bitcoin these days, but with an ETF coming up, I got to think crypto could be attractive to a trend follower. Am I wrong?
Well, no. Crypto is attractive to one of those three top categories for the dumbest ideas. So here's the trifecta. You need to have something that has no asset value, something that has no income and no potential for income, and has just appreciated 18 million % in the last 20 years, right? So if you have all three of those, that's like potential dumbest investment of 2023.
All right, Phil Taze, thanks so much for joining us. Phil Taze, he's the CEO, founder, Taze Asset Management, some really excellent performance numbers. Appreciate getting a few minutes of his time. The S&P 500 off about 0.6%. The Dow absolutely unched on the day. Nothing happened in there. The NASDAQ off about 1.4%. The Russell kind of hanging in there in terms of relative performance, down only 0.25%. So a lot of those technicians like to see, again, a broadening out of the market, seeing some of the small cappers do well. And we're certainly seeing that today. With our news in New York City, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul and Mike. With just a few weeks until the Iowa caucuses, GOP presidential hopefuls over the weekend furiously crisscrossed the state, hoping to boost support before the big day to challenge current GOP favorite Donald Trump on the national stage. The former president is still holding a commanding lead ahead of his rivals in Iowa. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis has bet big on the state, visiting all 99 counties in Iowa, but he's been losing ground to former UN Ambassador Nikki Haley. She's now neck and neck with him in Iowa. Meanwhile, the White House is talking about President Joe Biden's priorities in the year ahead. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
14 million jobs created. You see unemployment at under 4% in 22 months. You see gas prices going down. It's under $3 in 28 states. Those things matter, and that's incredibly important. And so we're hoping, what we want to do is continue to focus on Bidenomics and continue on lowering costs and prices for the American people.
Spokesperson Karine Jean-Pierre, speaking to ABC, also says they're working on abortion rights. In an 8-7 decision, the Israeli Supreme Court has invalidated a law that would have significantly weakened the judiciary. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's majority pushed through the law, nixing the reasonableness of the standard without reaching a consensus and ignoring widespread opposition at home and even abroad. Bloomberg's Elisa Odenheimer.
It all began about a year ago. You have to understand that this government is quite right-wing in comparison to previous governments.
Bloomberg's Elisa Odenheimer. A passenger plane and a Japanese Coast Guard aircraft collided on the runway at Tokyo's Haneda Airport, burst into flames. Officials say 5 people on the smaller plane were killed. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 11:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. I'm Charlie Pellet. We have got the Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ all in the red right now. We begin with the NASDAQ Composite Index down 1.4% right now. NASDAQ is down 209 points. The NASDAQ 100 Index down 238, drop there of 1.4%. Dow had been higher earlier this morning, down now by 20, a drop there of less than 1/10%, while the S&P 500 Index is down 27 now, a decline of 0.6%. 10-year yield 3.92% with a 2-year 4.31%. Gold up $2 the ounce to $2,064, up by less than 0.1%. Bitcoin rallying 3.6%, bouncing around at the 45,000 level, 45,212 on Bitcoin. And we do have West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.7%, 70.47 a barrel on WTI. So it is now a down day for the U.S. stock market. Doug Cass is the president and CEO of Seabreeze Partners. And on surveillance this morning, he told us he did get the last 2 months of 2023 wrong.
I think I underestimated the animal spirits and the price momentum that had been accumulated. I underestimated the power of the herd as the pressure on the upside intensified, and so did FOMO. I underestimated the contribution from market structure, which had basically intensified the upside to equities, and same applies to interest rates. The momentum and the yields to the downside accelerated.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcast. Dish Network and EchoStar have completed their merger, reuniting Charlie Ergen's satellite empire once again. The deal is key to Ergen's plan to transition Dish away from the dwindling pay TV business and toward wireless services, challenging the likes of Verizon, T-Mobile, and AT&T. Shares of EchoStar Corp, they are down 0.7%. Verizon up 2.3%, T-Mobile up 1%, and AT&T up by 2%. Recapping stocks lower, S&P down 27, drop there of 0.6%. I'm Charlie Pellet, and that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Mike Regan, Paul Sweeney, we're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. We're also streaming live on YouTube, so you can head over to youtube.com, search Bloomberg Radio. Let's talk commodities. Let's talk ETFs. Let's talk investing in commodities via ETFs. We can do that today because we got Bob Minter with us. He's here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio. He's a director of ETF investment strategy at Aberdeen. So, Bob, commodities, kind of a tough year last year. I don't know. I'm not a follow commodities. Mike McGlone, my commodities guy, just says buy gold. He says oil's going to 40, so what do I know? ETF flows, for commodities, where are you seeing the flows these days? Where are investors putting their money?
Well, Mike is a smart guy, and I'll agree with him on the gold. I'll respectfully disagree on oil, but I think your flow question is really an interesting one because it's something, and I heard your piece with Mike earlier, that really is for us one of the more bullish stories, and that is that, as Mike said, the central banks have bought a tremendous amount of gold, and what they're doing is they're lowering their exposure. They're diversifying away from the U.S. dollar. They're not leaving it. They're just at the margin moving away, which is great for gold. And what's helped the price stay relatively stable while they were accumulating large amounts of gold. And in 2022, that was 1,000 tons bought by central banks. 3/4 of the way through last year, it was 800 tons. What was offsetting that were ETF investors who, over the last year and a half, sold 650 tons of gold. The difference is ETF investors have stopped selling. So where is that supply going to come from if central banks keep buying?
Well, if we do switch to oil a little bit, my eyes kind of popped out of my head when Mike McGlone said he sees $40 oil.
He's been consistent on that call for a long time.
Yeah. But, I look at the chart over the past year, and it looks like once we hit 66, 67, it seemed to turn around every time. Is that a technical support level, or is that sort of where the U.S. starts filling the petroleum reserve? What's keeping oil above that level?
So the The fundamental, so there's two markets, right? Yeah. There's a cartel-controlled market, which is seeking to keep prices high enough that investments keep going into oil for CapEx, for future expansion, so that it doesn't create a market where, you know, we have $140 oil and then we have $40 oil. They're trying to keep the investment relatively stable. That can look very self-serving, and there have been points made that it's self-serving for OPEC to do that. But there actually is a fundamental reason to keep the capital expenditure money flowing into future production. And right now there's a lot of production that's offline, that's not being supplied to the market. And but I think the case that all of a sudden we're going to wake up and Thursday we'll all have an electric vehicle and no one will need oil again is really a misplaced one, because even if we could do that, personal vehicles only account for about 20% of the 100 million barrels a day of demand.
Yeah.
So we're a ways off from that, and we do ourselves a disservice if we stop investing in future production of that, because frankly we need it.
Do you consider Bitcoin a commodity or currency?
I don't consider it a commodity. It is probably not a currency. I have a hard time with ranking a crowd-funded fiat currency as superior to a government-funded fiat currency.
So this big move up in Bitcoin, we're now over $45,000 per token. That's, most experts tell me, and most reporting says, is predicated in part on the expectation that we will get an ETF. So now it comes into your wheelhouse. So what's your view on, I guess, a Bitcoin spot ETF?
So I think I'll go a little more fundamental here. The bid-ask spread on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies is massive. The volatility is massive. If you operate a trading desk, you have to trade it. You can't miss out on that. And that's behind a lot of fundamentally, there's no reason for it's a solution without a problem.
Right. So, Bob, when you look out at 2024, what are some of the commodity ETFs that you think have the best chance this year?
So, despite the negativity on electric vehicles that we've heard so far this year, we actually think that, and it's for good reason. You know, the $7,500 just came off about half the models that are offered, and then also you need to make about $130,000 to afford a $50,000 EV, according to financial planners, and the $7,500 stops once you make 150. So that's a very narrow. Something has to happen.
That's the U.S. tax credit.
That's the U.S. tax credit. So something has to happen there. But to think that any president is going to run for office this year and say, we're going to get rid of electric vehicles after the big automakers have invested this much money, it's just, you don't do that to your industrial base and get elected. Yeah. So the bigger story for us is the problem with copper supply. And it's just proving very, very difficult to get anything near the growth rates we need for copper supply to supply the nuclear power plants that are supposed to be built, the additional grid upgrades that are supposed to happen, your car charger in your garage, let alone your electric vehicle. And it's not really even very close.
So what do you do? So what's your copper call then, I guess?
So we like actually all of the industrial metals, and our way to sort of play the electric, the new energy field was to start a Bloomberg Industrial Metal Commodity Index, because we felt like whether a electric vehicle or wind turbine or solar panel installation was built in Europe, US, or China, they all have copper, aluminum, zinc, nickel, and we'll keep it simple, stupid. Like you get the theme right, but make sure you don't mess up the implementation. Interesting. And so that's worked a lot better than some of the electric vehicle startups.
Yep. All right, Bob, thanks so much for joining us. Bob Minter, he's a director of ETF investment strategy at Aberdeen, joining us live here in our Bloomberg radio studio here in Bloomberg HQ in New York. S&P 500 off about 0.4%, the Dow up 0.1%, but the NASDAQ off 1.25%. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
Hey there, Paul. Dish has bought itself more time to transition away from slowing pay TV business and more toward wireless services. Bloomberg's Joan Doniger has that story.
Dish and EchoStar completed their merger on New Year's Eve. Dish is looking to challenge Verizon, T-Mobile, and AT&T. Now it will have access to more cash and time to expand its 5G network build-out, as well as its mobile and broadband offerings. That will include fixed home wireless and Boost Infinite, a low-cost mobile service.
EchoStar is down about 0.4%. DoorDash looking to expand its services beyond the U.S. Bloomberg's Katie Greifeld has more.
DoorDash CEO telling the Financial Times that the company's two largest areas of investment are expansion and penetration outside the U.S. Now, if you think about DoorDash's expansion strategy so far, it's been to target smaller markets that its competitors haven't yet broken ground. Remember last year, DoorDash expanded into Austria and Iceland. They did that through a partnership with Helsinki-based Wolt.
The company's CEO also says DoorDash plans to move more into retail and grocery. BJ's, which used to be exclusive to Instacart, has partnered with DoorDash, and it's also working with Dick's Sporting Goods and Sephora. DoorDash right now is down about nearly 2.5%. And once flying high during the pandemic, sales of electronics and appliances, well, they're seeing a slowdown. Retailers like Best Buy are feeling it. Higher interest rates, they have more consumers cutting back on spending on those big-ticket discretionary items. But Bloomberg Intelligence says Best Buy's profit outlook, well, it's still on solid ground. Best Buy right now, they're up about 0.2%. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. We'll have more Bloomberg Markets in just a bit. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, a little bit of a mixed day out there in terms of the stock market. The S&P 500's off about 0.4%. The Dow's up 0.1%, and the Nasdaq's off about 1.3%. The Russell's flat on the day, though, so a little bit of outperformance there. Yields a little bit higher here. 10-year Treasury, that's up about almost 5 basis points, 3.92%. WTI crude oil is off 1.4% after some gains earlier today, $70.64 for WTI crude, so giving up most of the gains we'd seen in the last couple of weeks. Gold up just slightly here, and Bitcoin, it's up over 4%, 45,400 on the cryptocurrency. With our news in New York City, here's Michael Barr.
Thank you very much, Paul and Mike. Rescue crews are trying to find any survivors in the rubble after a series of powerful earthquakes that hit western Japan. At least 55 people are now dead, and thousands of buildings, vehicles, and boats are damaged. Bloomberg's Isabel Reynolds has more.
The town of Wajima, which is very popular with tourists. There's a sort of fish market that tourists love to go and visit. It seems completely decimated by an enormous fire that broke out. So I think more than 100 buildings, according to NHK, have been involved in this blaze, which is still ongoing. A lot of old wooden buildings, which are very prone to damage.
Officials are warning people in some areas today to stay away from their homes because of a risk of more strong quakes. A Japan Airlines passenger plane burst into flames at Tokyo's Haneda Airport after colliding with a Japanese Coast Guard aircraft. All JAL passengers and crew safely escaped. However, 5 Coast Guard crew members were killed. Democratic mayors are demanding more federal help as Texas continues to send immigrants to Democratic-run cities. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre.
It's shameful, and we need to call that out. Look, we've been in touch with mayors and governors in the northern part of the country to talk to give them and provide resources that they may need to deal with the influx.
Karine Jean-Pierre spoke to ABC. New York City's effort to stop migrant buses has resulted in the buses arriving instead in nearby New Jersey. Over the weekend, buses from Texas and Louisiana began dropping off hundreds of asylum seekers at several New Jersey transit stations. From there, the asylum seekers are believed to have taken trains to New York City. With the new year comes new state laws, from guns to minimum wage to inclusion programs. The federal minimum wage hasn't actually been raised in nearly 15 years, still stuck at $7.25 an hour, but states are taking matters into their own hands. 22 states are raising their minimum wage, and that means for many workers, it will now be $15 an hour or more. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg. Paul, Mike.
All right, Michael Barr, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Now let's talk a little global aerospace. Airbus managed to beat its annual delivery target in 2023 as a plane maker ramped up output in December. That's according to a website that tracks aircraft handovers. The world's largest maker of commercial aircraft likely handed over 733 planes to customers last year, according to preliminary data from Aviation Flights Group. Of those, 579 were for the best-selling A320neo family of single-aisle jets, the data show. Wide-body A350 aircraft accounted for 57 units, according to Aviation Flights Group. And I know, Michael, both Airbus and Boeing, they've kind of got a delicate balance here. Their customers, the airlines, want planes like crazy. They're ramping up their capacity, but it's still kind of hard to find the parts and the supply chain and all that to get to that production level.
Yeah, right. And one stat, Paul, that really stood out to me in this story was Airbus started December 97 planes short of its annual target, meaning they really ratcheted up in December. So I guess to some degree they're waiting on those parts, but once they get them, they can really ramp up production pretty quickly. So almost 100 planes short of the projections at the beginning of December, and able to beat them. Airbus, person familiar with the company, confirming that they did beat their target of 720 deliveries with more than 730 aircraft delivered. So a lot of new planes on the market.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we'll see them in the air shortly. But again, both Airbus and Boeing cranking out planes as quickly as they can because post-pandemic travel continues to boom. We'll have more coming up. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller.
Why were the economists so wrong? What are the economists getting wrong?
Isn't this a slam dunk time to buy U.S. Treasuries?
Soft landing, hard landing, no landing. I don't know.
True. What the heck does that mean?
I don't know.
Breaking market news and insight from Bloomberg experts.
We're going to be in an environment with higher rates for longer.
The 5-day in-office work week is effectively dead.
It's definitely a good sign that we're not ready to land this economy just yet.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up in this hour, we're going to talk about the big global banks. Allison Williams, Senior Global Banks and Asset Manager Analyst, will join us here via Zoom. Plus, we're also going to talk geopolitics, the hot spots in Ukraine, in the Middle East, with our go-to voice there. That is Mick Mulroy. He's a co-founder of the Lobo Group and has a tremendous amount of experience in all things geopolitics. And then we're going to talk ETF flows in the fixed income space. Joanne Bianco, partner of Bond Blocks, will discuss what's happening in the fixed income space. They focus on fixed income with their ETF products there. Right now, let's start off this hour with Mr. Charlie Powell.
Hi, thank you very much, Paul Sweeney. Happy New Year. And the Dow rally keeps on going. Yes, the S&P trading lower on this first trading day of the brand new year, but the Dow Jones Industrial Average right now is at a record, up 62 points, gain there of 0.2%. S&P in the red, down 19, drop there of just about 0.4%. NASDAQ, the NASDAQ Composite Index down 185, drop there of 1.2%, while the NASDAQ 100 Index down 218 points, lower now by 1.3%. Interestingly, a reversal for small cap shares with the Russell 2000 now up by 0.1%. Cannot ignore the move in Bitcoin today. Bitcoin is up 4.1%. Bitcoin at 45,413 on Bitcoin. Again, that is an advance now of 4.1%. 10-year yield 3.93%. The 2-year 4.31%. Gold up 0.2%, 2,066 the ounce. While we are looking at a retreat for West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 1% right now, 70.92 a barrel. So it is a mixed day right now with the Dow higher, the S&P, NASDAQ both lower. John Stoltzfus is Chief Investment Officer at Oppenheimer. He does remain extremely upbeat about 2014. He's got a year-end price target of 5,200 for the S&P, but just how much of that is dependent on the Federal Reserve.
We're not of the camp that's looking for 6 cuts this year in 2024. We're looking for perhaps 1 or 2, and we're not looking for the first half for cuts. We think it'll happen in the second half of the year and likely later rather than earlier in the second half.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. A downgrade for Apple at Barclays over soft demand for its latest iPhone. Apple shares are trading lower now by 2.9%. Again, recapping the Dow higher. Best level of the day right now at a record up by about 0.2%. S&P lower by 0.4%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pell, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Michael Regan and Paul Sweeney, we're live here in a Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio with you. We're also streaming on YouTube, so you can head over to youtube.com and search Bloomberg Radios. Charlie was just reporting some red and green on the screen. Not a lot of direction out there. Let's see about some stories, stock-specific stories. Let's go to Alex Semenova. She covers all of the markets for Bloomberg News. She joins us live here in our Bloomberg studio. Alex, what are you looking at today?
Hey, guys. So quite a busy day to start 2024. A lot going on under the hood today, but obviously, as Charlie just mentioned, we are all looking at Apple today. Shares down nearly 3%, of course, after a downgrade from Barclays on concerns over soft demand for its latest iPhone. Analysts led by Tim Long cut their rating on Apple to underweight from equal weight. They also trimmed the price target to $160 from $161. That implies a 17% decline over the next year. Basically, Long doesn't see revenue at the company's services unit growing more than 10%. They also said that channel checks show weakness in iPhone volumes, as well as a lack of a bounce back in Macs, iPads, and wearables. But even just beyond the fact that the stock got itself a new bear today, a part of the move lower is, of course, concerns about the Magnificent Seven. A lot of people are expecting them to lose their luster in 2024. So Apple, a big move lower there, weighing on the broader market.
Anything else out there that catches your eye?
Yeah, a lot of news from electric vehicle makers today. Tesla delivered a little bit more vehicles than expected in the fourth quarter, but it wasn't enough for the company to stay ahead of China's BYD in global electric car sales. Tesla handed over about 484,000 vehicles in the last 3 months, beating analyst average estimate, but BYD sold 526,400 fully electric vehicles in the quarter to become the new number one in EVs, driven mainly by its much broader lineup of cheaper models in China. Tesla's stock has been trading back and forth, up about 0.8% right now.
Alex, I was reading a story you worked on last week that kind of made me chuckle a little bit. The headline was, Wall Street's best and brightest flopped once again in 2023. Talk to us a little bit about, everyone seemed to have gotten everything wrong last year. Any sense of why that was and sort of what some of the biggest sort of flops were?
Yeah, I mean, I never envy anyone whose job it is to try to predict the market, but it was especially hard last year when we had an economy that simply defied all expectations. Everyone thought that we'd get a recession. Everyone was basically saying it was inevitable given the fact that we experienced one of the most aggressive rate hiking cycles in history, but consumers and U.S. companies held up very well. Some of the biggest calls going into last year were sell U.S. stocks. Obviously, that didn't play out because we ended with the S&P up 24%, nearing a record high. One of the other big calls was buy Chinese stocks. Everyone thought that we'd get this big reopening boom, but instead, obviously, they experienced a pretty terrible rout. And everyone also said buy treasuries. We thought that we would get a big rebound in bonds from 2022's rout. And Treasury yields ended about where they were at the end of 2022. So a lot of big calls coming into 2023, and pretty much all of them were wrong.
Maybe something too that George Costanza do the opposite strategy.
Exactly. So what is there a consensus for this year? Are people kind of cautiously optimistic? What are we hearing from the street?
It's very interesting. So initially when people were putting out their targets for this year, we heard a lot of big firms coming out saying the S&P is going to hit records. Bank of America with a call of 5,000. Goldman boosted its price target from 4,700 initially to 5,100, I believe it is the number. Lots of people calling for records, but if you look at the average, it stands at about 4,800. So implying very little upside next year. I think people are wary that they've missed last year's rally, that this year might not be as momentous as last year was. But interestingly, some of the calls are to look at more beaten down corners of the market, small caps, S&P equal weight, which has solidly outperformed the S&P since mid-November of last year. So that's kind of where Wall Street stands this year.
All right, Alex, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Alexandra Semenova, she covers the markets for Bloomberg News, joining us live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Broker studio here in New York City. Believe it or not, Michael, bank earnings are probably just a matter of like a week or two or three away. I mean,
yeah, J.P. Morgan usually starts us off.
I think so, but I mean, I want to get a sense of, how the big banks are positioned for 2024. I mean, are they expecting pick up a deal flow? Because it was kind of quiet in 2023. So who do we talk to? We talked to Allison Williams. She heads up all of our banks coverage for Bloomberg Intelligence. She also has got a day job as well at Bloomberg Intelligence. So Allison, what's your outlook for 2024 for some of the big banks, big investment banks for this year?
So I think, the main things for the investment banking business, trading, we think, is going to continue to be resilient. That's what we've seen over the past couple of years with sort of some fits and starts. I mean, fixed income really has held up well over the past couple of years. Equity trading has been a little bit more volatile, but we think that, going into next year, interest rates, we're looking at a potential inflection point here in the U.S., but we do think that with quantitative tightening, sort of an unprecedented environment, that there still are reasons for uncertainty, and that could continue to give some support through volatility. On the equity trading side of things, you mentioned deals. We do think that there could be some uplift to deals, especially if the Fed is done and we get some clarity on monetary policy, meaning that if the Fed is done tightening and starts to bring those rates down, we do think that that could lead to the clarity that some issuers have been waiting for, and we could get a pickup in fees. We did see some pickup in 2023, but it was, generally disappointing to what we had expected in the beginning of the year. And so to the extent that we do see some more IPOs and some more primary issuance coming to market, we think that feeds into secondary trading volume. So that's a positive. The other area in trading that's done very well has been prime brokerage. We think that going into 2024, that outlook continues to look pretty good.
Allison, it used to be a lot of people were able to sort of oversimplify the market for bank stocks and say higher rates good for banks, lower rates not so good. 2023 taught us that's not as simple as we thought it was. Some of the regional banks really struggling with losses on their books from the decline in the bond market. As we look out into 2024 and assuming this glide path lower for interest rates is with us for a little longer, is there sort of two sets of banks, those that will benefit from that and those that won't? How does the interest rate outlook play into how you're thinking about the market this year for bank stocks?
So I think what's important to remember about rates, as you said, I think there was this sort of mantra, higher rates are good for banks. But that's really only something that I think investors have been looking for, following the financial crisis. If we went way back, the mantra used to be that low rates were good for banks. And I think that, we were in this period of very extended, practically zero rates. And in that type of environment, it was just very difficult for banks to make any type of spreads. And that's why we got conditioned to look for higher rates. While higher rates were very good for the banks in 2022, the impact was a bit mixed last year because, the first impact is that rates go up, yields go up, and so we get the top line benefit or the pricing benefit. But what we had started to see last year happen was those costs catching up. So keep in mind for the banks that, the costs they pay for deposits, it's sort of like their cost of goods sold. And so seeing that catch up over the past year started to eat into the net interest margins. And so as we look forward, the perfect scenario, if you will, or Goldilocks scenario would be the Fed starts bringing rates down. Therefore, the banks do not have to increase their cost of deposits and can, in fact, bring that down a little bit. But if we get the soft landing, then credit costs should remain controlled. And perhaps we can, look to loan growth being a little bit stimulated by these lower rates. And so for the net interest income, as I said, it's a little bit trickier. You can't just look one way or the other anymore. But what we're really looking to hear from the banks is what's going to be happening with loan growth, because with the expectation that interest rate hikes are done, even if, we're not quite at the inflection point, we believe that we've got to be pretty close. And so if those interest rate hikes are done, that's good for, in general, the interest margin. But we really will need that loan growth to pick up to bring that income growth.
Hey, Allison, let's talk about Morgan Stanley. They've got a new CEO, Ted Pick, replacing longtime CEO James Gorman, who was really well respected, had a nice track record here. Should we expect any change in strategy, policy, communication from our friends at Morgan Stanley?
So we'll see. I mean, I think one of the most interesting things that Solomon has brought to Goldman Sachs has been the transparency there in terms of setting goals, being more detailed about goals, talking a little bit about what's going on. We're actually getting trading guidance now from Goldman Sachs. So that's been very interesting from Solomon and something that we hadn't quite expected. So for Morgan Stanley, we'll see if Ted Pick changes the debate at all. We do know that he really comes from the institutional side of the business. That has really been downplayed under Gorman. And in fact, over the past year, Goldman Sachs has sort of regained its lead in equity trading, and Morgan Stanley has sort of ceded that. But I do think that the biggest challenge for TEDPIC is going to be living up to some of the very aggressive wealth management goals that Gorman set about a year ago, last January. One of those very aggressive goals is to add $1 trillion in assets every 3 years. The manager actually looked like they were on track for doing that in the first half of the year. A huge slowdown in the third quarter, and so that's what we're going to be looking at for Morgan Stanley for the near term. Is there a rebound in fourth quarter? Are things stabilizing? And then again, I think the long-term challenge for TEDPIC is living up to some of those aggressive wealth management goals, and then back to sort of the equity trading side that I mentioned. Can they regain the lead there?
Allison, we've spent a lot of time talking about how so many people got so many things wrong about 2023, whether you're an economist, a strategist, or an analyst. I have my fingers crossed that you and your colleagues at BI got some things right, though. Is there any good news among your predictions from you and your colleagues at BI from 2023? Anything to brag about last year?
I think we did. We did our own retrospective, and I would say that in part we got about half right, and I think at least 51% right is the goal across.
That's a living right there.
Those who make predictions.
Absolutely.
I would say that one of the things that we got right from the equity strategy side of our department is there was the S&P 500 earnings. We expected that they would trough, that it would be a very shallow decline and then trough and improve. And Gina Martin and Adams and her team were correct on that. So that does look optimistic going into next year. One of the things that did not play out was the small cap recovery. And part of the reason was what we saw with interest rates in 2023. Now that we're nearing the end of that rate cycle, perhaps 2024 is going to be the time for a recovery in those stocks and finally, getting some good returns there.
All right, Allison, thanks so much for joining us. Allison Williams, she is the Director of Research for North America for Bloomberg Intelligence. She's also the Senior Banks Analyst leading that team, covering all the big global investment banks. We're going to have earnings coming out of those banks. They lead us typically in these earnings cycles 4 times a year, and so probably in a couple of weeks' time, JP Morgan will kick it off, and we get a real good sense of what's happening out there in the global economy. Because, I love listening to Jamie Dimon's commentary and then his Q&A, because he doesn't have much of a filter. He's in a position in his life, he can say pretty much whatever he's thinking.
Absolutely, and everybody in the world listens word by word.
Exactly. So S&P 500, we're off 0.5% today, red and green on the screen. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now. Lisa Mateo.
Thanks, Paul. X, formerly known as Twitter, is now worth less than a third of the price Elon Musk paid for it. Axios reports Fidelity has marked down the value of its shares in the company again and believes it's worth 71.5% less than at the time of the purchase. Now, sticking with Musk, his other company, Tesla, it delivered more vehicles than expected in the fourth quarter, but it's not all good news. Bloomberg's Ed Ludlow explains.
In the fourth quarter, 484,507 EVs delivered by Tesla. That was ahead of estimates, and it does mean that Tesla exceeded its target of 1.8 million vehicles in 2023. Go back to a year ago, January 2023, the first earnings call of the year, where Elon Musk said that 2 million units would be possible in the full year.
Shares are up about 0.2%. Now, Tesla also dropped behind China's BYD in global electric car sales. BYD posted a record sales quarter, selling more than 526,000 fully electric vehicles to become the new king in EVs. Now, that was mainly driven by its larger lineup of cheaper models in China. BYD's shares in China right now, they're down more than 2.5%. And Rivian, it missed expectations for quarterly electric vehicle deliveries, even as production ramped up during the past year. The company built 17,541 EVs in the final 3 months of 2023 and delivered nearly 14,000. Now, delivery shortfall, it highlights those challenges facing the automaker, particularly in a year of lingering supply chain issues and also slowing growth in the EV market. Rivian down more than 9.5%. Those are the company stories we're following this hour. I'm Lisa Mateo. This is Bloomberg.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow pushing higher, trading at a record, up another 75 points right now, building on last year's gains. Right now, we've got the Dow up by 0.2%, higher by 79 points. S&P down 19, dropped there of 0.4%. The Nasdaq Composite Index down 1.3%, now lower by 196 points. Stocks and treasuries dropped as traders trimmed their bets on interest rate cuts. 10-year yield 3.93%, the 2-year 4.32%. Bitcoin surging 3.8% right now, back above 45,295 right now on Bitcoin. Spot gold virtually flat on the day, up now by about 63 cents. West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.3%, $70.70 a barrel on WTI. Tesla delivered more vehicles than expected in the fourth quarter as the Elon Musk-led company dropped behind China's BYD in global electric car sales. Right now, we've got Tesla lower, little change, down less than 0.1%. Rivals Rivian down 9.7%. Lucid up by 1.1%. Again, recapping, stocks are trading mixed. The Dow higher by 0.2%. S&P down 0.5. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pella, thank you so much. We appreciate that. Michael Regan and Paul Sweeney, we're live here in the Bloomberg Interactive Broker Studio. We're streaming live on YouTube, so you can check us out there. Unfortunately, there's no shortage of geopolitical hotspots around the world, and we're fortunate to have someone who can really help us stay on top of it all. That's Mick Mulroy. He's the co-founder of the Lobo Institute. That's just the beginning. He's a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East at the U.S. Department of Defense, former paramilitary operations officer at CIA, and then for many, many years, a U.S. Marine Infantry officer. We thank him for all of his service here, sincerely. Mick, I don't know where to start. There's so many hot spots around the world. Let's just start in the Middle East. I guess the latest headline is Iran is kind of poking around there. What's your latest assessment on what's happening there in the greater Middle East these days?
Also great to be with you guys and Happy New Year. I think obviously Iran's been poking around all this the entire time. They are the common denominator behind Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, and the militias that keep attacking our positions in Syria and Iraq. But now they are entering the Red Sea with one of their naval vessels, which looks like they want to be somewhat confronting the United States without confronting, and certainly looking like they are. And that's, of course, not going to be helpful when it comes to the U.S. interest in containing this conflict in Gaza and not spreading to a regional war.
Well, Mick, I was going to ask you, what is the chance of that happening? I mean, could this really escalate into the type of thing where the U.S. and Iran are fighting more directly? Is that a threat these days?
So I do think it's a threat. It's something we don't want. I don't think Iran wants, and it's not obviously in any country in the region's interest. I think the biggest threat from that comes from Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah, who is currently in violation of UN resolutions where they are up at the border between Lebanon and Israel. Israel's made several statements. Their senior officials, including their Minister of Defense, that they might need to actually take action to push them off that border. If that happens, this would be expanding substantially, and it's one of the reasons why the U.S. sent so many naval assets to the region, just in case there was a significant second front opened in this conflict, that we would be there potentially to assist or Israel if they needed. I don't think that means that Iran's going to become directly involved in the conflict. I think they're happy to fight to the last proxy force, but generally don't want to put their troops into the mix. But that's something that's to be determined, whether if this expands, that could happen, or whether Israel takes more strikes specifically against Iran if they feel threatened.
Mick, I guess, what's the latest, do you think, we're seeing, hearing from the Israelis about kind of where they want to take this here? I know they brought some troops home, but is there any change, do you think, to their strategy here?
So the U.S., of course, has been pushing for this new phase, going from what they're calling high-intensity combat to low-intensity conflict. I would point out that doesn't mean it's not a conflict. There's still going to be combat operations. But I think this withdrawal of 5 brigades is substantial. It was partially because a lot of these are reservists and they need to essentially go back to their full-time occupation. But it does indicate to many that this might be that transition. So we might go from this large-scale combat operations, conventional forces, to a more targeted, precise, intel-driven special operations type mission there. That said, it's been clear that Israeli senior officers have said that this could last for the entirety of 2024. So that we're far from it being over, but I think the U.S. would like to see this switch into this next phase, which hopefully would also have far fewer civilian casualties and the potential to increase the humanitarian aid going into the Gaza, which is sorely needed.
Mick, if we shift gears a little bit to the situation in Ukraine, it seems to me that the political will in the U.S. to continue to fund the Ukrainian resistance is starting to run low, and potentially this might be the year where we actually stop funding that war. What does Ukraine and really the world look like if that's the case? I mean, is it just a pretty much an instant Russian takeover of Ukraine, or how do you see that playing out?
So I don't think it'd be an instant Russian takeover of Ukraine because of the Ukrainians. They will fight to the end. They've proven that, and I think we should take note of that, because if you remember when this started, a lot of very senior military analysts, including intelligence services, were predicting their fall within weeks, and look where we are now. When it comes to the United States credibility, I think it would be shot, to be frank. This is a partner who is in an existential fight. If we were to pull out now, our credibility when it comes to that, I think, would go down substantially. And it is, I think, the morally right thing to do for a partner that's been invaded by an adversary of ours, but it's also in our own interest. I mean, last month alone, according to multiple reports, the Russians lost 30,000 soldiers.
Wow.
I mean, think about that. 30,000 soldiers. They have degraded the Russian military capacity below 50% of what it was before this started. That means every dime we've spent has added to our own national security benefit. It would make no sense to me and I don't do politics, but it makes no sense to me why we would continue that support. It's in our own interest. Every dollar we spend on that assists us when it comes to our own national defense.
Mick, as we get into, I can't remember what year we are of this war. Unfortunately, it's much longer than anyone would like. Is there any expectation that there will be a negotiated settlement here? Admiral Stavridis, former head of NATO, made the comment recently to us that he believed is something like a Korea, peace for land type situation is probably the best outcome.
So that certainly could happen. I think what the Ukrainians need is to really push the capacity of Russia to stay in Crimea, which will push them to the negotiation table. I think right now what the U.S. can do is to really start providing them more offensive weapon systems. We started that. They started their counteroffensive before they had anything near what we would need to do what they have been trying to do, which means more F-16s, which are just getting there, more main battle tanks, and more long-range artillery, which really has been a game changer. If they can start challenging Russia's ability to stay in Crimea, that's when I think President Putin will say, maybe I need to start talking about a negotiated settlement. And then I think it's up to the Ukrainian people what they're willing to potentially give for peace. And that's something that I think we should support. We should also allow them to make that decision and not push that on them.
Mick, as Paul said, there sure are a lot of hotspots around the world these days. So I want to take you over to China a little bit, too. One of the big concerns in recent years was some aggression from China towards Taiwan. We seem to have dodged that bullet, but am I being sort of too optimistic there? Is that still a risk going into 2024 that we see some sort of aggression towards Taiwan?
So I do think it's still a risk, and we should not take that lightly. I think what we're doing in Ukraine actually impacts that. When China looks at the type of partner the United States is to the Ukrainians after Russia essentially invaded them, they're going to look at potentially what we might do with Taiwan if they were to either do a blockade or an actual attempt to invade Taiwan. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that the Chinese military is not ready to do this yet. So it's not that we've dodged a bullet. They just don't have the capacity, I don't think, to even do a blockade that would actually hold up yet. But they're driving that direction. They're significantly improving their Navy. They're significantly improving their overall military capacity, in part so they could do this in the future if they elect to do that. Right now, I think we need to be a good partner to show that we're a good partner, so they have that understanding. And Taiwan obviously needs to take the lessons learned from Ukraine and start looking at how they can make themselves a harder target, because that might be ultimately what makes the Chinese decide it's not worth it.
Hey, Mick, just about 20 seconds left. Where could we see a positive surprise in some of these hotspots around the world this year?
So a positive surprise. If you would have said a surprise, that would have been an easy answer. A positive surprise, I would hope that once we get all the weapon systems that we've promised and we support Ukraine, that Ukraine could get to a point where Putin realizes he could be in a phase of catastrophic failure. I think strategically he's already failed, but a catastrophic failure is regarding Ukraine itself. And that would push him to the negotiation table, but it requires all of the partners of Ukraine, our allies, to continue support, and of course, them do their job, which they are, which is fighting tooth and nail to get back every piece of territory that Russia took.
All right, very good. As always, Mick Mulroy, co-founder of the Lobo Institute, giving us the latest on the geopolitical issues out there facing a lot of folks. Right now, with our news in New York, here's Dan Schwartzman.
Thanks, Paul. 5 Japanese Coast Guard personnel were killed as a landing Japan Airlines Airbus 350 collided with a taxiing Coast Guard plane at Haneda Airport in Tokyo. All 367 passengers and 12 crew members were able to evacuate the passenger plane, which caught fire, with 17 injuries reported. The JAL plane took off from Sapporo an hour earlier, while the Coast Guard plane, which was carrying aid, was heading to the northwest region of Japan, which was hit hard by Monday's earthquake. At least a dozen gas canisters were found in the car involved in the New Year's Eve crash outside a concert venue in Rochester, New York. 2 people were killed, with 3 people taken to local area hospitals. The gas-laden Ford Expedition, driven by 35-year-old Syracuse native Michael Avery, collided with another SUV near a crosswalk before plowing into a group of pedestrians who were leaving the Kodak Center. Avery is in the hospital with life-threatening injuries. Rochester Police Chief David Smith says a motive has yet to be established.
We've not been able to identify that there was anyone else involved in the crime or that it was part of a larger plot. Additionally, we have not uncovered any information leading us to believe that the actions of Michael Avery on New Year's Eve were motivated by any form of political or social biases.
That's Rochester Police Chief David Smith. 4 people have been killed in Beirut, Lebanon, in what is being called an Israeli drone strike. The state-run Lebanese national news agency says an office belonging to Hamas was hit. According to the terror organization, the deputy head of their Politburo, Saleh al-Aruri, was one of the victims of the attack. Russia continues to intensify attacks on Ukraine as 4 people were killed with 92 wounded early this morning as the Kyiv and Kharkiv areas were hit hard by missiles. Russia claims it downed 17 missiles fired from Ukraine at the Belgorod region of the country. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Dan Schwartzman and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 12:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. I'm Charlie Pellet. We have got the Dow Jones Industrial Average trading at the best level of the day. The Dow is at a record as we kick off this new trading year. Right now, the Dow up 97 points, a gain of 0.3%. The S&P, NASDAQ, both in the red, both trading lower right now, with the S&P down 15 at 47.54, a drop right now of 0.3%. We've got the NASDAQ Composite Index lower by 184 points. That is a drop right now of 1.2%. Russell 2000, though, in the green. Russell 2000 up by about 0.3%. 10-year yield 3.94%. The 2-year 4.32%. Gold up 0.1%. 2,064 the ounce. Bitcoin up 3.3%. 45,042 right now on Bitcoin. While West Texas Intermediate crude oil is down 1.7%. 70.83 for a barrel of WTI. So bottom line here, the Dow pushing higher. S&P, NASDAQ, they're both lower. Phil Taze is the CEO and founder of Taze Corp. And this morning, right here on Bloomberg Markets, he offered up this advice for investors.
What investors want is not the very best performance. They want to be in the markets but not get blown to pieces. So for equities, take half of your equities, put it into hedged equities so that if markets turn down, you're going to have some potentially bolstering, offsetting appreciation in some things. For fixed income, be adaptive. Like have an unconstrained fund that can be in different parts of the market, T-bills, high-yield bonds, investment grade.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Tape podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Dish Network and EchoStar have completed their merger, reuniting Charlie Ergen's satellite empire once again. The deal closed December 31st. It is key to Ergen's plan to transition Dish away from the dwindling pay TV business and toward wireless services, challenging the likes of Verizon, T-Mobile, and AT&T. Again, recapping, stocks are trading mixed. S&P's down 16 now, dropped there of 0.4%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Mike Regan and Paul Sweeney, we're live here in our Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. We're streaming live on YouTube, so you can head over to YouTube and search Bloomberg Radio, and that's where you will find us. Let's talk bonds, and let's talk ETFs. You can combine that discussion with our next guest. Joanne Bianco is a partner at Bond Blocks Investment Management. These are the folks that really focus on the fixed income market via the ETF wrapper. Joanne, thanks so much for joining us here via Zoom. As we start the year here, where are you seeing kind of your clients' interest these days? Where are you seeing the flows?
Well, we're seeing flows in a lot of different areas, actually. We're seeing flows into our high yield funds, and particularly we've seen almost daily flows into our highest risk fund, lowest rated, the CCC fund. The ticker for that is XCCC. We've also seen a lot of flows between our treasury suite of, if you know, they target duration instead of maturity. And so we're seeing investors not only continuing to like the short end with our XHLF and XONE, which are half year and 1 year ETFs, but we see them going out longer, as long as our X20 ETF.
You know, Joanne, I was amazed looking at the last year's performance of the CCC rated ETF, up more than 19%. What drove that? Was it just so much pessimism entering the year about a recession and that these struggling companies, the default rate would be higher? What happened to drive that really impressive return for that very risky ETF?
Well, started the year yielding over 15% and spread over treasuries of over 1,000 over.
Wow.
And that was probably just in hindsight, you know, it was punished too much in 2022. And with the resilient economic conditions that we saw throughout 2023, you know, it enabled that fund and CCCs in general to outperform. You know, we did not have a spike in defaults last year. They increased somewhat, but not to the point where, you know, you definitely did not see recessionary conditions. And so the resilience that we saw, including companies that were rated the lowest in high yield was actually, quite refreshing.
So we're seeing mortgage rates come down along with, the treasury market here. What ETFs do you have, or do you direct clients to if they want to play the mortgage-backed security market?
Well, we don't have anything in particular in the mortgage-backed security market, but our high-yield ETF that it focuses on financials and REITs is probably a play on that, as you'd see rates come down.
And you expect to see the Fed to be as aggressive as maybe the market's pricing in right now?
Probably not. I mean, our whole view, for the past year and a half has been not to fight the Fed. So, we believe them when they talk about their 2 to 3 rate cuts for next year, and we're not as optimistic as the market. The market's been overly optimistic for over a year and a half now. So.
Yeah, Jen, one of the bigger ETFs among your offerings is the 6-month target duration U.S. Treasury ETF, assets of more than $1 billion. I'm curious how people are using that. Is it kind of like an alternative to cash, to a money market fund? Is there an advantage to using an ETF in that fashion compared to a money market fund?
Well, yes, in that it has really low fees. The fees for that are only 3 basis points. Versus money market funds are higher on average in terms of the fees that they charge. And also, it's very liquid, it's easy to use, it's yielding over 5%. So in low volatility. So there's just a lot of reasons why there's been a lot of demand for that fund.
So we saw the outperformance in high yield in 2023. Do you expect that to continue in 2024? Because, again, there's a lot of recession talk out there. We haven't seen it, but there's a lot of talk out there.
Yeah, so our base case view is that the U.S. economy will continue to remain healthy. In today's higher interest rate environment, we're not forecasting a recession, even in our downside view at this point. Obviously, we're always watching for, signs that change our view, but that's what we think right now. And so that supports the high yield market around current valuations. So we're still at elevated yields, and it's basically an asset class which offers the highest coupon income you can find in U.S. public markets, either equity or fixed income, with less volatility than stocks. So we still like high yield at this point.
Is it safe to extrapolate your opinion on the economy to the idea that 6 rate cuts that are being priced into the short-term interest rate market, is that a lot of people don't believe that's really going to happen? I'm curious what you're thinking about it.
Right. Yeah, that's not our estimate that it would be 6 rate cuts at this point.
All right, Joanne, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Joanne Bianco, Bond Blocks. They're the folks that are in the ETF business, and their ETFs are focused on the fixed income space. So it really gives investors lots of different ways to invest in fixed income.
Yeah, which it's amazing how the conversation has shifted over the past couple of years, where everyone was so eager to take that risk in the stock market, and now you see a short duration treasury ETF with 5% yields. It really changes the game completely.
Yeah, it's just amazing. All right, so bring us up to date, Mike, on this Bitcoin ETF. So we could get a ruling from which body?
This would be the SEC. Yeah, okay. They face a deadline on Kathy Wood, the ETF she is proposing with a partner, 21 shares. They face a deadline of January 10th, so next week. And the thinking is that
will they approve a spot Bitcoin ETF?
Spot Bitcoin ETF. Yeah, there is futures, Bitcoin futures ETFs.
And the assumption is, if that were to happen, then investors will be flocking all over these things.
Yeah,
demand for Bitcoin.
This is the thinking, in that they won't approve just one. There's something like a dozen waiting to be approved or denied. So obviously, whoever gets that first approval gets a real first mover advantage. Yep. And the thinking is that the SEC is going to want to avoid that. But this is all conjecture and speculation.
Yep.
We're going to have to wait till the 10th and see what happens.
But it could come a little earlier, perhaps.
Of course, yeah, that's their deadline. So we're on the edge of our seats this week.
All right, we'll keep an eye on that. This is Bloomberg. Let's get some company news right now with Lisa Mateo.
Thanks, Paul. Analysts at Barclays expect softer demand from Apple's latest iPhone and are downgrading the stock because of it. We get more from Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle.
Analyst Timothy Long saying that channel checks show that demand for the iPhone 15 lackluster, expecting the same could be true for the iPhone 16. In addition, he does not expect services to grow more than 10%. And he's saying that there's not a quote-unquote bounce back for the Mac, iPad, and wearables.
Now, it's the first time Barclays cut Apple to underweight since 2019. Apple shares, they're down more than 3%. And while the investors rescued Juul from bankruptcy, well, now the company is fighting a lawsuit from some who are crying foul.
The bailout of Juul Labs in 2022 came with help from two longtime directors. That deal won them releases from liability and thousands of lawsuits against Juul. Now the Wall Street Journal says Juul is fighting a different lawsuit, one from a group of investors who charged those two directors were looking out for their own interests, not the company's.
And that was Bloomberg's Joan Donica reporting. A more than 2-year-long pilot hiring spree is starting to slow down. The Wall Street Journal says Delta Airlines plans to hire about half as many pilots next year as it did in 2023. Now, in a memo, the carrier said it plans to bring about 1,100 pilots next year, which is higher than a typical year, but not as much as in recent years. Delta right now is up about 1%. And Airbus managed to beat its annual delivery target in 2023. According to Aviation Flights Group, the company likely handed over 733 planes to customers last year. Airbus ADRs, they're up about 0.2%. Those are the company stories we're following. I'm Lisa Matei.
This is Bloomberg Markets with Paul Sweeney and Matt Miller on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, coming up, we're going to look at these markets here. We got the S&P off 0.25%, the Dow up 76%. I'm sorry, let's take that back. S&P is off 0.5%, and the Dow's up 0.2%. There you go. And the Nasdaq's off 1.5%. Looking at the bond market, up about 7 basis points here on your 10-year Treasury, 3.94%. WTI crude oil off just slightly here, just above $71 per barrel. It was over 73 earlier today. Bitcoin is the story, up 3.3%, 45,000 right there for Bitcoin. So continuing to move higher. Expectations that you get that spot ETF for Bitcoin sometime in the next week or so. With our news in New York City, here is Dan Schwartzman.
Thanks, Paul. At least a dozen gas canisters were found in the car involved in the New Year's Eve crash outside a concert venue in Rochester, New York. 2 people were killed, 3 people taken to local area hospitals. The gas tank-laden Ford Expedition, driven by 35-year-old Syracuse native Michael Avery, collided with another SUV near a crosswalk before plowing into a group of pedestrians who were leaving the Kodak Center. Avery is in the hospital with life-threatening injuries. Rochester Mayor Malik Evans says folks were at the concert to have a good time.
These folks were going to see a Grateful Dead tribute band, and they were expecting to be able to ring in the new year and have a good time. But instead, we have individuals that are now going to be burying family members, and we have people who have now life-altering injuries because of the choices that this suspect made.
That's Rochester Mayor Malik Evans. 4 people have been killed in Beirut, Lebanon, in what is being called an Israeli drone strike. The state-run Lebanese national news agency says an office belonging to Hamas was hit. According to the terror organization, the deputy head of their Politburo, Saleh al-Aruri, was one of the victims of the attack. The death toll has risen to 48 after the magnitude 7.6 earthquake hit the Noto Peninsula on Japan's northwest coast. Rescue workers continue to search for survivors trapped under rubble, with 120 appeals for rescues from collapsed buildings. A tsunami warning for the Sea of Japan coast was lifted Tuesday morning. In a loss to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's right-wing coalition, Israel's Supreme Court overturned a law that weakened the justice's own power. By a vote of 8-7, the court struck down a law passed by Parliament in July that would have barred judges from voiding government decisions as unreasonable. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Dan Schwartzman, and this is Bloomberg. Paul, back to you.
All right, Dan, thank you so much. We appreciate it. Let's talk a little European natural gas. Prices there fell to the lowest in almost 5 months as ample supplies allowed traders to brush off an expected cold snap in the region that risks boosting fuel demand. Frosty conditions are expected to take hold in parts of Northwest Europe later this week, potentially raising heating demand. Yet other factors like subdued industrial gas consumption, high storage levels, an increase in renewable generation, and steady flows from top producer Norway are keeping a lid on prices. And it takes us back to where we were maybe a little bit more than a year ago. We were thinking about with the Ukraine and Russian natural gas being shut off effectively for most of Europe. What would that do to Europe in terms of its natural gas and its ability to just kind of heat folks over the winter? But last winter was a little bit milder than expected, got through it just fine, and it seems like supply levels are pretty good right now.
Yeah, it's amazing, Paul, because you used to think of natural gas being not something that was really easily replaceable if there was a disruption from supplies. But I get, the world has sort of adjusted to life after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and Norway taking up the slack, other alternative sources taking up the slack. I do wonder about that one line that said subdued industrial gas consumption is part of the story. It makes you wonder what's going on there, if maybe there's a macro signal for the economy there.
Some red headline breaking on the Bloomberg terminal. Harvard President Claudine Gay resigns. That's according to the Harvard Crimson. So, we had seen the president and the board member, head of the board at University of Pennsylvania resign. Yeah. Now the Harvard president, Claudine Gay, resigns in fallout from some of the Hamas-Israel coverage.
Yeah, this is something Bill Ackman, the hedge fund manager, was really agitating towards pretty strongly on X, formerly
Absolutely.
Twitter.
And
so.
he has a big platform in all types of, whether social media or just a platform from his financial services. We'll have more reporting on that coming up. Sound On with Joe Matthew from Washington, D.C. That starts right now.
Cool. Didn't break anything, I hope.
from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from DC's top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover that.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew on Bloomberg Radio.
It is officially 2024, therefore we don't have to be embarrassed talking about a presidential election. It's legitimate. We're going to talk about Donald Trump's ballot challenges in Colorado, in Maine, Nikki Haley's push in New Hampshire. Where does Chris Christie fit into that? And yes, we're only 17 days out from a government shutdown, partial shutdown deadline on January 19th. 4 out of the 12 bills have to be passed by then, and Congress is not doing much. So we're going to talk about the presidential outlook and what needs to be done when Congress eventually comes back. I'm Jack Fitzpatrick, sitting in today for Joe Matthew in the fastest 2 hours in politics and policy here in Washington. And the first person I've got to hear from, of course, is Charlie Pellet with the Market Update.
Thank you very much, Jack Fitzpatrick. We are looking at a mixed market. Do want to begin, though, with the developing story. We brought the headline to you moments ago, worth repeating. Harvard President Claudine Gay has resigned. Shortest tenure in university history, Harvard University history. This, according to the Crimson. Again, Harvard President Claudine Gay has resigned. Developing story will have more details as they become available. Stocks and treasuries dropped as traders trimmed their bets on interest rate cuts. The NASDAQ 100 index is declining. Right now, it is down by almost 1.7%. The NASDAQ Composite Index down 1.6%, down 239 points. S&P down 26, drop there of 0.5%. Dow Industrials advancing for much of the morning, up 59 points right now. Was trading at a record. Right now, we have got the Dow up by about 0.2%. 10-year yield 3.94%. The 2-year 4.32%. Gold flat on the day right now at $2,062 the ounce. Bitcoin up by 3.4%. 45,097 on Bitcoin. And West Texas Intermediate crude is down 0.7%. 71.12 for a barrel of WTI. As for the market backdrop, as we begin the new trading year, Chris Marangi is Chief Investment Officer at Gamco Investors.
You've got the Fed wind at your back in 2024. You've got an economy that has probably hit a soft patch, but I don't think it's going off a cliff. So I think that gives some room for a broadening out of the market. Small caps had a great December. I think that probably continues into at least the early part of 2024. So a broadening of the market, some of the neglected sectors, neglected size companies.
And you can hear more of that conversation on the Surveillance Podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Mike Mayo is doubling down on his bullish call for Citigroup. The Wells Fargo analyst has already named Citi his top pick among big bank stocks for 2024, replacing JP Morgan Chase as his favorite. Citigroup, which reports at the end of next week, along with JP Morgan Chase up now by 2.9%, JP Morgan up by 0.9%. Again, repeating our top story, Harvard President Claudine Gay has resigned. This, according to the Crimson. Stocks are trading mixed. S&P down 26, drop there of 0.6. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much, Charlie. Jack Fitzpatrick here from Bloomberg Government, sitting in for Joe Matthew today. Whole lot to talk about, and we will talk to our panel a little later, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zano, about that big news that just broke on your Bloomberg terminal about Harvard President Claudine Gay resigning. If you saw the clips of her congressional hearing last month, you know why. But first, I'm here in the studio with Stephanie Lai, national politics reporter here at Bloomberg, and there are so many things to talk about. We're in the right month to talk about the New Hampshire and Iowa primaries. Things are getting rolling. It is a presidential election year. It is officially 2024. Maybe the first thing I want to touch on with you is two ballot challenges, two among others, but Colorado, and in case our listeners missed it over the holidays, Maine have moved to take President Trump off the primary ballot over the constitutional measure that says you cannot be on the ballot if you have engaged in insurrection. He is banking on the Supreme Court to block that from happening. Stephanie, I'm curious about the political angle of, it seems like Trump is using this, is banking on this as a motivating issue for his supporters. It's so unusual. I'm curious when you can call this a trend. There's two states. I mean, where does this fit into? One, is this a real threat for former President Trump in the primary? And two, how is he playing it?
Certainly. So, I mean, I guess to start, the cases that we're seeing right now are just a handful of ones that are going to be continuing to come down. And so how we see this Supreme Court respond is really going to determine how the rest of 2024 plays out. I guess on one hand, Trump's team has been really great at politicizing these legal issues that he continues to face. Whenever, an indictment had come down, we had seen them really make the point that, Washington, Democrats, everyone's out to get him. They're trying to stop him. And they've been using this to really energize his base because their belief is that they have the votes to really win, but it's just a matter of getting people to come out and having these legal cases continue to make news, to put him, in front of TVs all day for, months on end. It really just does help his political case.
Well, he is ahead, but I want to get into where he's ahead, how much he's ahead. Among early states, do you have a view on where the most legitimate challenge is coming from? There's been so much back and forth in New Hampshire we'll get into the details of Chris Sununu saying Chris Christie should drop out to sort of make room for Nikki Haley in New Hampshire. Is it New Hampshire? Is it Ron DeSantis' push in Iowa? Is there a credible threat in the Republican primary anywhere to Donald Trump?
At this moment, in terms of the 4 early voting states that we've really been looking into, it doesn't really seem like these competitors have made much leeway in trying to cut off his momentum. He leads by about 25 to 30 percentage points in all of these states. The latest Iowa Des Moines Register poll showed that he had over 50% of the support from likely caucus goers. And so the way that DeSantis has tried to bet big on Iowa really makes it seem like they're trying to cut him off early. Meanwhile, Nikki Haley's trying to make the argument that in New Hampshire and South Carolina, she can really make leeway. And, polling shows that she's within striking distance to Trump. So if anything, I don't think we're going to see it very early on, but there is a chance we'll see some movement likely after New Hampshire, maybe South Carolina.
All right. Well, after New Hampshire, I'm curious about New Hampshire. Because as you said, if you look at polling averages, if you look at a lot of polls, solid lead for Donald Trump. We are going to talk in a few minutes to Chris Galdieri out of St. Anselm College, which has probably one of the best looking polls lately for Nikki Haley. 44 to 30, down 14 points. I think that plays into the call by New Hampshire Governor Chris Sununu for Chris Christie to drop out. In that poll, Christie got 12%. It doesn't entirely make up the whole difference. I mean, it seems we're getting close enough, obviously, to these early primaries, so there's pressure to consolidate. I mean, does that make a difference? Is this a matter of, especially in New Hampshire, is this a matter of Trump opponents not consolidating quickly enough, or is it just an insurmountable lead for Trump at this point?
No, I think you have a really interesting point there, and it's something that political operatives have been telling us for months, that, with this wide field, it's been almost impossible to cut away at Trump's lead because there's so many different directions that voters can, go towards. And so, as you point out, maybe there is a chance that in New Hampshire we see some sort of movement that gives Nikki Haley the momentum to make the argument that she is a viable alternative to Trump. But I think the question after these early voting states is whether or not she has enough support in the Super Tuesday states, everything else, in order to get enough delegates to get her that nomination.
Certainly an interesting point, how pivotal New Hampshire is for Nikki Haley. If she can't pull off a miracle there, what happens next? Stephanie Lai, national politics reporter with Bloomberg here. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to bring in Chris Galdieri, St. Anselm College professor in New Hampshire. They've got a poll out recently. Just came out. It was conducted December 18th and 19th in New Hampshire. Professor Galdieri, thank you so much for joining us. Top line takeaways here, a 44-30 lead, Trump over Nikki Haley. And I'm really interested on your take on, is there consolidating that can be done among the anti-Trump candidates, the non-Trump candidates? Is there a move to be made, or is there any evidence that this cake is baked and a 14-point lead is very solid for Trump and there's not going to be much more movement? Do you see an opportunity for a challenger in these polling numbers?
I think there is an opportunity, but I think it's probably a very narrow one. When the greatest news your campaign has had all year is that you're only down by 14 points, that's not necessarily the sign of a John McCain style upset in the offing. That said, if it's going to happen anywhere, it's probably going to happen here. New Hampshire is a state that has had a rocky relationship between Trump and the Republican establishment, such as it is in the state. It's a state that Trump tried mightily to carry in 2016 and 2020 and failed both times. I think, you do have a lot of Republicans in the party who have never made their peace with Trump. That said, I'm not sure all of the non-Trump vote comes from the same place, by which I mean, we've talked a lot about Chris Christie and should he drop out, but I think the folks who are supporting Christie are the same sorts of folks who, voted for Bill Weld. Remember him 4 years ago when he challenged Trump in the primary? These are the folks who are like the really dedicated never Trumpers. And I think the folks supporting folks like Haley are more like the Republicans who, well, they were okay with the tax cuts and they were thrilled with the judges, but do we really want another 4 years of that? Wouldn't it be nicer to have somebody else? And so I'm not sure that those two groups necessarily come together.
So that sounds like a real limit on the ability of Nikki Haley to get Chris Christie's votes. I mean, I can't ask you to give me a percentage if Chris Christie drops out, how much goes to Nikki Haley. But does it go somewhere else? Is it clear who specifically benefits if Christie were to drop out? Which, of course, I'm raising because of Chris Sununu's push to get him to drop out.
Right, and there's really no logical place. I mean, I guess maybe some of those folks do go to Haley if they see her as the strongest opponent. But I think one of the stumbling blocks for this suggestion that Christie should drop out and endorse Haley is, I think Christie is pretty dedicated never Trumper at this point. And I think his concern, if he were to drop out and endorse someone else, is what if that candidate loses? Are they willing to endorse Trump and support Trump? And I think that would be a deal breaker for him. And we've had lots of indications from Haley that, she's not going to go all the way to the extent of not supporting Trump if he does wind up with the nomination this time around. I think she's made noises about being willing to pardon him for various offenses as well. These aren't the sorts of things you say if you're prepared to throw the guy overboard if you lose to him. So I think bringing those different groups of never Trump Republicans and lukewarm on Trump Republicans and pro Haley Republicans, it's just it's not as straightforward as simply, okay, Christie has 12, we had his 12 to Haley's 30, suddenly we've got a 44-42 race.
Tell me a little more about the identity of the New Hampshire Republican primary voters specifically. I'm thinking of somewhat of a libertarian bent, but I mean, you touched on it with Trump's history there. What do we learn about Trump's place or any candidate's place in the broader Republican field based specifically on this New Hampshire Republican primary electorate?
Yeah, New Hampshire Republicans are really something of an outlier in the National Party these days. As you said, the party has a real libertarian bent to it. You see that on issues like abortion. You see that on issues like labor unions. You see this on issues like same-sex marriage and transgender rights and that sort of thing. It's not that the Republican Party here is overwhelmingly in favor of those things, but you have enough Republicans who, for instance, are pro-choice or who oppose right-to-work laws, who are supportive of transgender rights, that it makes sort of wholesale culture warring that you might see in other states' Republican parties. It makes it a lot harder to pull off here. The folks here who are Republicans, a lot of them tend to be much more in the sort of old guard Yankee Republican mold than they are with rhetorical bomb throwing, culture warring sorts of Republicans that you see increasingly in other parts of the country these days.
Well, it may not be a perfect case study for obvious reasons on the impact, if there is an impact, on of Nikki Haley's comments, her back and forth on the Confederacy, the cause of the Civil War, first not mentioning slavery and then saying, of course, slavery was the issue, the primary issue. The St. Anselm poll was conducted before that back and forth. I mean, just with your understanding of the voters, the numbers at play there, would you expect her to take much of a hit among New Hampshire Republican primary voters based on that flub?
I think there's a little bit of a hit. I think she has time to recover. I think what was dangerous about that for her is that, this is a question everybody knows the answer to. It's slavery. Homer Simpson knows the answer to that question, if you remember the episode where he was helping Apu pass a citizenship test. To not say slavery and then try to say, oh, well, it was the federal government overstepping its bounds and everything. Nobody believes that she believes that. So I think it looked like pandering. It looked like pandering to an audience that isn't really present here, but might be more of a factor in subsequent contests. And I think it just sort of, a big part of her pitch has been, look, I'm a truth teller. I'm going to be a straight shooter with you, that sort of thing. And then to completely flub what caused the Civil War is just, not a great look. That said, I think this is probably something that reporters cared about more than voters. And, my guess is that when people finally vote 3 weeks from today, that there will not be a whole lot of voters who, go into the voting booth and they're prepared to fill in the circle for Nikki Haley and say, oh, but wait, she said something silly about the Civil War back in December. I think that voter is one guy named Phil.
Real quick before we have to go, can you make a prediction yet? Who's the real front runner in New Hampshire?
I think the real front runner is still Donald Trump. And I say that because as much as we've had some good polls for Haley, the good polls have her, down by 14 points. We haven't seen a poll that has her in the lead. I don't think we've seen a poll that has her within single digits of Trump. So I think the challenge for her is, can she get herself into first place? And if she can't get herself into first place, can she get the kind of really close second place finish?
When the good news
could keep her alive.
Is that you are down 14, it's not very good news. We're going to keep it going in just a minute with Rick Davis and Jeannie Schianzano on our panel. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 121 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We do have the Dow holding on to gains, up 45 points right now, trading at a record, up 0.1%. Start of a brand new trading week, and we've got the S&P in the red, down 25, drop there of 0.5%. Not just a new trading week, but first trading week of a brand new year. NASDAQ down 235 points now, drop there of 1.6%. Stocks and treasuries dropped as traders trimmed their bets on interest rate cuts. 10-year yield 3.93%, the 2-year 4.31%. Gold higher, a little changed, up $1 the ounce now to 2,063. Bitcoin, though, cannot ignore that move, up 3.4% with a 45,000 handle, 45,114 right now on Bitcoin. West Texas Intermediate crude oil down 0.8%, 71.08 a barrel. A downgrade for Apple at Barclays because of expectations of soft demand for its latest iPhone. Barclays analysts, led by Tim Long, cut their rating on Apple stock to underweight with a price target of $160. Apple shares now at $185. Apple today down by 3.7%. Again, recapping, S&P down 26, drop there of 0.5%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
This is Bloomberg Sound On Bloomberg Radio.
Harvard President Claudine Gay will resign this afternoon. The latest from the Harvard Crimson, saying it will be the shortest presidency in the university's history. And of course, this is really not limited to a Harvard story, a campus politics story. This, I think, and we'll see what the panel thinks, but I think clearly comes on the heels of last month's exchange in Congress, pressed by Congresswoman Elise Stefanik on whether calling for a quote-unquote intifada violated the campus's anti-harassment policy. It was a question that several presidents of universities were not prepared for, clearly, including Claudine Gay. Let's go to the panel. Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino here for some insights on what seems to be, to me, a bit of a proxy for the difficulty of handling the politics of the Israel-Hamas war and the U.S.'s deep interest in it, that also seems pretty tough for President Biden. Rick Davis, let's start with you. What should we read into, given the fact that somebody's losing their job over the difficulty of answering questions about not only this conflict, but anti-Semitism in the U.S., U.S. voters' support for different factions. To me, this seems to spell bad news for President Biden because people are in serious trouble. But what is your takeaway in the broader picture with today's news about Claudine Gay?
Yeah, I think you make a good point about how does all this roll up to politics on a national level. We're in the middle of a presidential campaign. It is the season. And I think with the point you make about President Biden, you know, he has a lot at risk because the coalition of Democrats that make up the Democratic Party is probably more adversely affected by what's going on in the Middle East right now than the Republicans are. Republicans generally are aligned with their support for Israel, right? And so once you get sort of straight on that, there's not a lot of complication. Democrats, however, have a much different, much more diverse constituency. And we see it in places like Michigan with a very large Arab population, Muslim population that are going to affect the potential outcomes of a Michigan election as it relates to President Biden, and it's a key swing state. Harvard, clearly a bastion of Democratic liberalism within the Biden administration, and so when something controversial happens there, it reverberates through that administration, and I think Claudine Gay had a lot of other problems besides her very poor appearance at the House of Representatives before the holidays. But ultimately, that is the stone that broke the window. And I think it shows us that this is still a very salient situation, very salient issue with American opinion makers, but also voters.
Jeannie Sheehan Zaino, I have to ask you about especially the pressure from both sides, on both sides of the issue for President Biden in particular, because and we'll analyze polling over time on exactly how motivating it is as an issue for pro-Israel voters, for, I think, younger Democrats who are calling for not only a ceasefire, but in some cases the U.S. blocking off aid to Israel. Where does this leave President Biden? And is he in an impossible position because of the pressure coming from multiple angles?
You know, I'm not sure I would join together her decision to resign under pressure, obviously, as you talked about so much with President Biden. You know, I look at this is specific to what was happening with Claudine Gay. You know, she did survive her really out-of-touch performance before Congress, her equally out-of-touch emails to the student body. But in the end, she lost support amongst the faculty, amongst administrators, and importantly, students. Some of the best reporting on this story have come from Harvard students, so kudos to them. And the calls over the last few days for her resign in the wake of this plagiarism allegation, and it wasn't just one or two, it was multiple. And you have students who have just gone through finals. They have signed these Harvard honors code with their faculty. And then to hear over and over again that the leader of the academy herself is charged with plagiarism became too much for Harvard to bear. So, you know, this to me is specific to Claudine Gay, to, you know, the out-of-touch experience with Congress, certainly, but essentially to what was happening behind the scenes at Harvard as she was charged with these allegations. President Biden has a separate issue, which is the issue of support for Hamas, which has been a long-standing issue on the Democratic side with liberals, and Rick rightly talked about Michigan. That is going to be something he has to contend with. At this point, I'm not certain we can say it will impacting at the polling booth, because history shows very few Americans vote on the basis of foreign policy. The question in my mind is there enough to change support in a critical state like Michigan? I think that's a fair question. And I think we have seen the president, he went out on a limb to call out Benjamin Netanyahu. He has not been happy with how the prime minister has handled himself. So I think he is responding to some of that already, and we'll have to take a wait and see attitude if liberals hold this against him and decide to vote third party or just stay home, which in a state like Michigan would impact him.
Well, let's take a broader look at President Biden's struggles here, or his very tough position. Looking at the USA Today Suffolk University poll that just came out today, published this morning, President Biden currently has support from 63% of black voters. That compares to 87% in 2020. He actually trails Trump in this poll by 5 percentage points. He won by a 33-point margin in 2020. And looking at young voters, this poll has Trump ahead among voters under 35 nationally, 37 to 33%, a narrow lead. That is taking 2020 numbers and flipping them on their heads in some cases. Jeannie, I don't know if we can say this is indicative of every poll that's going to come out and every crosstab that shows us where he stands with young voters and non-white voters, but this looks like a very, very bad position. How much work does President Biden have to do among black voters, among Hispanic voters, and among young voters?
It is so important. This is what I think is the most critical aspect of what's coming down the pipe for him over the next year. Donald Trump in particular, but the Republican coalition more broadly, has been making great strides. The group I look at most often are Latinos. You add to that African Americans. You add to that, as you mentioned, young people. Joe Biden, any Democrat, cannot win if Republicans are making the gains Trump has with that group. I mean, I think what we are starting to see, quite frankly, is a realignment of the parties, and you are seeing a populist a group forming, and there are Latinos, African Americans, and young people part of that on the Republican side. If that keeps up, that's a problem for the Democrats. And, you know, it reminds me, remember 08-12 when Republicans lost, they did this great, you know, piece looking back. What do we have to do now? We have to make up with Latinos. That was the big takeaway from that. And nobody thought Donald Trump, of all people, would do that with his comments on undocumented immigrants. And yet he has. We've known that's a problem for Democrats, and it continues to be. And this poll is so important out of USA Today, showcasing just that.
Rick, sorry to put you in a tough position, but what's the 20-second version of what Donald Trump did to improve his standing with Black, Hispanic, and young voters?
You know, look, he's not Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden's the issue here, not anything Donald Trump did. And Joe Biden has not done enough to create opportunity for these young voters. The economy is everything to them, and it's been, you know, really bad for the entire term of his presidency. In this poll, there's some optimism to be had, but for the Biden people, but they've got a long road to hoe.
A story of Biden's struggles more than anything. Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino sticking with me as we'll get to Congress's very long to-do list coming up and deadlines coming up very soon. Now let's get a check on world and national news with Dan Schwartzman in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom in Washington.
Thanks, Jack. As you've been hearing on Bloomberg Radio, the Harvard Crimson reporting that University President Claudine Gay will resign this afternoon, ending the shortest presidential tenure in university history. Gay served just 6 months and 2 days and had come under increased scrutiny after her December 5th congressional testimony on anti-Semitism on Harvard's campus, as well as multiple allegations of plagiarism in her academic work. Harvard's highest governing body, the corporation, is expected to announce Dr. Gay's resignation by email later today, while Gay is also expected to make a statement. 4 people have been killed in Beirut, Lebanon, in what is being called an Israeli drone strike. The state-run Lebanese national news agency says an office belonging to Hamas was hit. According to the terror organization, the deputy head of their Politburo, Saleh al-Aruri, was one of the victims of the attack. At least a dozen gas canisters were found in the car involved in the New Year's Eve crash outside a concert venue in Rochester, New York. 2 people were killed, with 3 people taken to local area hospitals. The gas-laden Ford Expedition, driven by 35-year-old Syracuse native Michael Avery, collided with another SUV near a crosswalk before plowing into a group of pedestrians who were leaving the Kodak Center. Rochester Police Chief David Smith says a motive has yet to be established.
We've not been able to identify that there was anyone else involved in the crime or that it was part of a larger plot. Additionally, we have not uncovered any information leading us to believe that the actions of Michael Avery on New Year's Eve were motivated by any form of political or social biases.
That's Rochester Police Chief David Smith. 5 Coast Guard personnel were killed as a landing Japan Airlines Airbus 350 collided with a taxiing Coast Guard plane at Haneda Airport in Tokyo. All 367 passengers and 12 crew members were evacuated. Global news 24 hours a day, whenever you want it. Bloomberg News Now. I'm Dan Schwartzman.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 1:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. I'm Charlie Pellet. We begin with a developing story and a headline from the Bloomberg Professional Service. Harvard President Claudine Gay is now confirming that she is quitting that role. We've got more coming up here on Sound On, and of course our coverage will continue to begin. But again, the headline right now on the Bloomberg: Harvard President Claudine Gay does confirm that she is resigning. Stocks are trading mixed. Stocks and treasuries dropped as traders trim their bets on interest rate cuts. S&P now down 22 points, a drop there of 0.5%. The Dow has been holding on to a gain for much of the session, up 61 points, up 0.2%. The Nasdaq Composite Index, so a lot of weakness in tech stocks today. Nasdaq down 228, decline there of 1.5%, while the Nasdaq 100 Index is down 261, a drop of 1.6%. 10-year yield, 3.94%, with a 2-year that's yielding 4.32%. Bitcoin up 3.6%, 45,194 on Bitcoin. Spot gold, little change, down less than 0.1%, down 67 cents, 2,062 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude down 1.5%, 70.54 a barrel. The government will issue its monthly jobs report on Friday, and the data could show America's labor market slowdown continues. And with that story, here's Bloomberg's Vinny Del Giudice.
Economists are forecasting the unemployment rate edged higher in December, rising to 3.8% from 3.7%. They also see payroll growth moderating. Bloomberg Economics says recent job growth has been concentrated in health care and government employment, while job shortages are fading. Separate data Wednesday is forecast to show there are about 8 million job openings nationwide in November. 2 years ago, job openings set a record of 12 million. Vinny Del Giudice, Bloomberg Radio.
Dish Network and EchoStar have completed their merger, reuniting Charlie Ergen's satellite empire once again. The deal is key to Ergen's plan to transition Dish away from the dwindling pay TV business and toward wireless services, challenging the likes of Verizon, T-Mobile, and AT&T. EchoStar up 1.3%. Among cell phone providers, Verizon up 3.2%, T-Mobile up 1.2%, AT&T up 3.3%. And that's a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound on Bloomberg Radio.
A government shutdown deadline is coming up. Yes, yet again. January 19th, the deadline for Congress to act on 4 of the 12 bills to fund the government. I'm Jack Fitzpatrick from Bloomberg Government, filling in today for Joe Matthew. No deal in sight as of right now. Not a lot of movement on Capitol Hill. They'll come back next week with a very, very full plate. And in fact, there are some members, a few at least, on Capitol Hill negotiating, at least on the topics of Ukraine aid and the U.S.-Mexico border security measures. I'm here with the panel, Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino. Guys, we have to look forward to another deadline where Congress is kind of behind the 8 ball. January 19th is the first deadline. Then they face a bigger deadline on February 2nd for a strong majority of government funding when that expires. Rick, I have a broad question for you right now regarding the new speaker, Mike Johnson. Where does he stand with the Freedom Caucus right now? The last time there was a big funding fight with Kevin McCarthy at the helm, there was the undercurrent of conservative members who wanted to push him out of the speakership. I'm curious how long a leash Mike Johnson still has as the new but not brand new speaker, and are conservatives itching for a fight like they were with Kevin McCarthy?
Well, I know Marjorie Taylor Greene got expelled from the Freedom Caucus. Expulsions seem to be the thing to do in the House these days. But she did declare the honeymoon is over for Johnson right before the holidays. And I think that's probably right. I think it's basically back to every man for himself. Freedom Caucus obviously has been the biggest proponent of shutdown, biggest opponent of the speaker. both this one and the previous one, Kevin McCarthy, in ways that has not, allowed the House to function very effectively. I suspect they will try to do the same thing. Whether Johnson then turns to Democrats in order to support his legislative agenda, including trying to pass funding bills, is a big question mark. He starts by taking a delegation of Republicans down to the border to rail against the administration's policy. Not really what you would think of as far as setting a tone in Congress to try and get something productive done.
Yeah, Jeannie, is there an appetite among Democrats to do anything that comes across as helping Mike Johnson? I know they expect their votes will be needed to fund the government ultimately if there's going to be bipartisan support. But is this a speaker who seems worth bailing out in any sense to Democrats?
I don't think they will act in the interest of bailing him out. I do think they will act in the interest of keeping the government open, as they have. But the problem for Kevin McCarthy, who has finally now left Congress, leaving another vacancy, and now for this accidental speaker, Mike Johnson, is that the problem has not been the other side. It has been their own far right flank. And what Rick just described is sounds like a bad cage match or something, which is what we're probably going to be looking at this year. I was just looking back. You remember, Jack, it wasn't that long ago we started the 118th with how many ballots to get a speaker. We finally got McCarthy, shortest ever in history. Went through so many. Finally, we get this accidental speaker. And Marjorie Taylor Greene is one of a few who have been public about the fact that he is not going to get their support anymore. The honeymoon is over. And I think his going to the border is actually probably the only thing he can do besides press hard to impeach Joe Biden, because these people don't want to act positively in the interest of funding the government or anything else. They are destructive, and all he can do is try to keep them focused on an enemy rather than asking them to work across the aisle to get something done. And that's just the same thing that got, Kevin McCarthy outed.
Well, I'm especially interested in this border trip. Speaker Mike Johnson going to the border tomorrow. Representative Tony Gonzalez, the Republican from Texas, says he's hosting about 60 members in Texas tonight and tomorrow, and they'll go to the border tomorrow. There are Republican members of Congress, Jeannie, who say that this is such a bad issue and such a bad situation on the border that they feel, and I know there's rhetoric there, they feel they're almost doing Biden a favor by forcing his hand, and he can say, I didn't want to do anything conservative on the border, but that it's something that needs to be done. Republicans certainly feel like they have the upper hand politically in pushing for something on the border. I mean, do Republicans have a clear upper hand when it comes to border politics? Is this something that is an albatross for President Biden, or are they giving me some spin, Jeannie?
I think we're getting spin to the extent that, yes, absolutely, they are right. There is a crisis. I'm in New York City. There is a crisis across the country regarding immigration. The numbers were 250,000 undocumented people coming over the border. We know from Homeland Security just last month. But the reality is, I would feel better about what they were saying if there was an inclination to pass legislation. And that is something that we don't see an inclination to do. And by the way, I think there's zero chance that Donald Trump allows Joe Biden to get any legislation passed on the border. The Biden administration is open to doing a lot of things on the border. They can't do it alone. It depends on Republicans in Congress, and I don't see that happening. So they're right, there's a crisis. I wish they'd follow that up by saying we're serious about legislation, but I don't see that happening.
So if we're counting potential failures this month, that's one potential failure, especially if Donald Trump steps in and comes out opposed to any border deal. Possible partial government shutdown. Let's touch very briefly on Ukraine aid, because that's tied to those border talks. Rick, the Republican stance on Ukraine has shifted. I mean, are they willing in Congress to let Ukraine aid die, very briefly?
Yeah, look, I think the Senate is going to try and revive their deal, which, as you point out, Jack, relies upon a border agreement in order to push through Israel and Ukraine funding. And I think there's still a shot at that, but time's wasting.
Time is wasting indeed. 17 days until that government funding deadline. Rick Davis and Jeannie Sheehan Zaino. Great analysis. Coming up, I'm going to hand it off to Kaylee Lines. I'm Jack Fitzpatrick. This is Bloomberg.
Your company news headlines on Bloomberg Radio.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Airbus managed to beat its annual delivery target in 2023 as the playmaker ramped up output in December. And with more, here's Bloomberg's Denise Pellegrini.
Charlie, the world's largest maker of commercial aircraft likely handed over 733 planes to customers last year. That's according to preliminary data from Aviation Flights Group. Of those, the group says 579 were for Airbus' best-selling A320neo family of single-aisle jets. And the group also says wide-body A350 aircraft accounted for 57 units. Airbus and rival Boeing, well, they're both trying to strike a balance between customers buying planes in record numbers and suppliers on the backside still struggling to keep up with the faster pace of production. Charlie?
And that's Denise Pellegrini reporting. We got ADRs of Airbus trading higher, little changed, up by about 0.1%. Boeing shares, though, are tumbling now by 3.1%. Chevron will book fourth quarter charges of $3.5 to $4 billion, citing assets it sold in the Gulf of Mexico and policies in California prompting the company to slash investments in the state. Now, in a filing, Chevron said it will impair some of its U.S. oil and gas production assets, mostly in California, because of, quote, continuing regulatory changes there. Oil stocks higher across the board. Chevron shares, they're advancing now by just about 1%. And those are some of the top company stories that we are following for you at this hour. I'm Charlie Pelletan. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg Sound on Bloomberg Radio.
Whole lot of news on what could have been, should have been, would not have been a sleepy January 2nd as we look at Trump's ballot challenges, Nikki Haley's push in New Hampshire, a push for Chris Christie to drop out there, and a long to-do list for Congress when they come back. Great insights from the panel. I'm Jack Fitzpatrick, filling in for Joe Matthew, about to hand the baton off to Kaylee Lines for the second hour. And of course, right now, we've got to go to Dan Schwartzman for a check on world and national news.
Thanks, Jack. Certainly not a slow January 2nd, to say the least. As you've been hearing on Bloomberg Radio, Harvard University President Claudine Gay has now confirmed a Harvard Crimson report that she is resigning, ending the shortest presidential tenure in university history. Gay served just 6 months and 2 days and had come under increased scrutiny after her, what many call disastrous, December 5th congressional testimony on anti-Semitism on Harvard's campus, as well as multiple allegations of plagiarism in her academic work. Harvard says Provost Alan Garber is to be named interim president. 6 people have been reportedly killed in Beirut, Lebanon, in a suspected Israeli drone strike. The state-run Lebanese national news agency says an office belonging to Hamas was hit. The attack is the first on the Lebanese capital in nearly 2 decades. According to the terror organization, the deputy head of their Politburo, Saleh al-Aruri, was killed. Al-Aruri was also known as the mastermind behind the Palestinian terror group's armed wing in the West Bank and is the most senior Hamas member to be eliminated since the October 7th attack on Israel. At least a dozen gas canisters were found in the car involved in the New Year's Eve crash outside a concert venue in Rochester, New York. 2 people were killed, 3 people taken to local area hospitals. The Ford Expedition, driven by 35-year-old Syracuse native Michael Avery, collided with another SUV near a crosswalk before it plowed into a group of pedestrians who were leaving the Kodak Center. Avery is currently in the hospital with life-threatening injuries. Rochester Mayor Malik Evans says folks were just at the concert to have a good time.
These folks were going to see a Grateful Dead tribute band, and they were expecting to be able to ring in the new year and have a good time, but instead, we have individuals that are now going to be burying family members, and we have people who have now life-altering injuries because of the choices that this suspect made.
That's Rochester Mayor Malik Evans. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Dan Schwartzman, and this is Bloomberg. Jack, back to you.
Dan Schwartzman in the Bloomberg 99.1 newsroom here in Washington. Thank you so much. Jack Fitzpatrick rounding out the hour in place of Joe Matthew. And let's bring in Kaylee Lines, who's leading us in the second hour of Sound On. Kaylee, whole lot to talk about today. Politics, policy, upcoming deadlines. What are you leading off in the second hour with?
Well, Jack, we know the month of January is going to be an absolute doozy. You have Congress coming back next week. There's going to be a funding deadline, but also it's really the kickstarting of the 2024 presidential race in earnest, as we're now less than 2 weeks out to the Iowa caucuses. So we're going to have more on where exactly American voters are in terms of what they're prioritizing, how they are feeling about the incumbent president and those who are seeking the presidency. Mohammed Yunus of Gallup is going to be with us. He's the editor-in-chief over there. And Gallup found that at the end of last year, Biden's approval was at 39%. That's the lowest of, frankly, any modern president at this point in their presidencies. So we're going to get more on that data and what it means for the Biden campaign as they move forward this year.
Huge issue, and I'll just reiterate the point that Jeannie Sheehan Zaino made just a few minutes ago on some of the other polling we've seen when we were discussing the USA Today poll from Suffolk University that just came out, showing such key constituencies for Biden that he's struggling with. Black voters, Hispanic voters, young voters under the age of 35, making the point that former President Trump and Republicans have made a real push to reverse their very significant losses that they saw in 2020. Very interested to hear what you've got to discuss with Gallup, of course, an authority on the approval or lately the disapproval of President Biden. But lately, certainly a tale of a strong base emphasis for former President Trump and a weaker base of support for President Biden. Great analysis from Rick and Jeannie, as always. Stephanie Lai and Chris Galdieri came on. Great analysis from them on the politics. And, of course, the second hour of Sound On starts now.
from our nation's capital, this is Bloomberg Sound On.
Two major stories that we're following here developing before our eyes.
What does it say about Trump's influence on the Republican Party?
What can the Biden administration do on its own to support Israel?
Bloomberg Sound On. Politics, policy, and perspective from D.C.'s top names.
The Republican caucus is at war with itself.
Members of Congress would have a press conference every day if somebody would cover them.
There is bipartisan support for Israel.
This is one of the big ones we only see once every decade or 2 decades in the Middle East.
Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome to the second hour of the fastest show in politics, our first Sound On of 2024. I'm Kaylee Lines. Joe Matthew is out today as we begin this new year, and what a year it is going to be. The presidential race really taking shape now with the Iowa caucuses less than 2 weeks away. We're going to get a sense of where exactly voters stand with Mohammed Yunus, the editor-in-chief of Gallup, coming up. Plus, we'll have more on Congress's to-do list as they return next week, facing down a very quick deadline to avert a government shutdown. Nathan Dean of Bloomberg Intelligence will be with us, as will our very own Nick Wadhams, who covers national security for us here at Bloomberg. We'll get the latest from the Middle East as Israel attacks Hamas targets in Lebanon and Iran sends a warship to the Red Sea. So all of that is coming up. Let's first, though, get a check on these markets. It may be a new year, but we still got the same guy. Charlie Pellet, how's it going?
It's going very well indeed, and here's what's going on. We have got the Dow higher, little change. NASDAQ very close to the worst level of the day. Let's begin there. We are seeing weakness in tech names. The NASDAQ 100 index now down 302 points, drop there of 1.8%. We've got NASDAQ down 264, drop there of 1.8%. S&P is tumbling 31 points now, down 0.6%, while the Dow Jones Industrial Average is up 7 points, little change now, up less than 0.1%. Stocks and treasuries dropped as traders trim their bets on interest rate cuts. We've got the 10-year yielding 3.94%, the 2-year now 4.32%. Gold down $1 an ounce, little change there. $2,062 the ounce, down less than 0.1%. West Texas Intermediate crude down 2.1%, $70.16 a barrel. And Bitcoin now surging 3.6%, 45,187 on Bitcoin. Well, certainly for the 2024 election cycle, the focus is on the economy. Aditya Bave at Bank of America Securities told Surveillance this morning the U.S. consumer is in a good place as the new year begins.
So we think the American consumer looks good. That's the bottom line. I think if you start with the foundation of an unemployment rate less than 4% and wage inflation more than 4%, that is a great starting point for the U.S. consumer. You look at spending through the holidays, November retail sales look solid. Our card data through the second week of December look pretty good.
And you can hear more of the conversation on the Surveillance podcast. You can download it wherever you get your podcasts. Tesla delivered more vehicles than expected in the fourth quarter as the Elon Musk-led company dropped behind China's BYD in global electric car sales. Tesla shares, they're down now by about 0.1%. Among other EV makers, Lucid down 0.8%. Rivian, though, seeing big losses today. Rivian down 10.8%. Recapping, stocks are trading mixed. S&P down 31, drop there of 0.7%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, with a look at the first trading day of 2024, thank you so much. And of course, 2024 means election year is officially upon us. We're now just over 11 months away from November, when voters will head into the booth to decide who they want to be president of the United States. Of course, a lot could happen between now and then. We do still have to get through the Republican primary race, even though Donald Trump at this point is seen as the presumptive Republican nominee and incumbent President Joe Biden, the presumptive Democratic nominee. And yet when you look at polling, they consistently show that U.S. voters would not like to see the 2020 rematch that is taking shape here. They want someone else that isn't Biden or Trump. And then also polling continually shows that the incumbent president is dealing with a bit of an approval problem as he heads into this election year. So we want to get more on that now. I'm pleased to say joining me here in our DC studio is Mohammed Yunus, who is the editor-in-chief of Gallup. Mohammed, great to see you. Happy New Year to you.
Happy New Year.
I'm not sure that President Biden is feeling particularly happy as he comes into this new year, knowing he ended last year 2023, according to Gallup's figures, with an approval rating of just 39%. Can you give us some context around that number? It's quite low.
It is quite low. It's a couple points higher than his previous reading, but I think the real context is compared to every other president in modern history who has sought re-election, he's far behind where they were. Traditionally speaking, what we've seen in our numbers is that a president going into a re-election campaign at that 50-point mark is a really critical number to be at. And obviously, President Biden is far behind that, but he's also significantly behind where Barack Obama was and where Donald Trump was, which is pretty important to note, I think. During the Trump campaign, there was so much focus on how low and steady the number stayed. And President Biden right now is behind where President Trump was.
Well, and you talk about the numbers staying low and being pretty steady. Isn't that the case with Biden? I mean, he's been in and around that kind of 40% figure or below for some time now, and it doesn't seem like that needle has moved to any real degree at all.
It hasn't. He started off like most presidents do in a honeymoon phase. He has that 57% approval, which is pretty high for in our era. Another thing, Kaylee, to always keep in mind with these numbers specifically is we are in what is truly is a hyper-partisan era. So since President Obama, the difference between people's views on the president and how closely it's tied to their party ID is stronger than ever. So presidents have had flatter sort of frequencies on their approval ratings. But I think what's concerning about President Biden's situation is that even compared to Obama and Trump, who also face that reality, he's significantly behind right now.
Well, you talk about party ID. Are we seeing changes in that as well? I know Gallup's done some work around this, the idea that people are just changing the way they identify politically in these hyper-partisan times.
Absolutely. And you opened up by saying, you know, there's a lot of potentially unpredictable things can happen. One of the really big changes that's happening in America is this heightened and sustained number of people who are identifying as independents. So today, 41% of Americans say that they identify as independents. It's basically half of that for Democrats and Republicans. So party image is not really great in the public right now. A broader data point I think that really drives that home is we just released our latest on satisfaction with the electoral process in the United States. 71% of Americans say they are dissatisfied. So there are so many data points I can go through to really draw the picture of how people are not particularly pleased with neither the options they have, how the parties operate, or how the system operates more generally.
Okay, well, let's talk about the options. I mentioned that we're seeing pretty consistently in polls that the majority of voters would prefer it not to be a Biden-Trump rematch like 2020 all over again, and yet that's likely what they're going to get, unless there is a viable alternative. What are you seeing around support for a third-party candidate, whoever that is?
Well, I can tell you who we see in terms of favorables of all the folks that are out there right now. President Biden and Trump are basically tied at 41% of a favorable rating, and this is, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of the following person? DeSantis, Haley, and DeSantis, Haley in specific, are at their 30, so really low 30% favorable rating. It's important to note that this tends to happen with new names. People don't know who they are. Kennedy, on the other hand, is already breaking the 50-point mark, but that's probably because of that name recognition factor that he has in his favor. So looking at the favorable ratings, which is really a really good proxy, I think, at this point of the contest to see who's gaining traction with the public, really none of them are. Nobody's really shot through the roof and impressed or wowed. Of course, January 15th is just down the street. A lot can change, particularly when those first results start coming out from the caucuses. But right now, nobody's dominating.
Well, and ultimately, this all comes down to what the voter is feeling as they head to the polls, when they're making that decision who they're going to cast their vote for. So whether this is feeding into what is making people disapprove or approve of President Biden, or just how they're thinking heading into an election year, where are they ranking their priorities? What does the American voter care about the most?
The American voter always and forever cares about the economy when they come to vote. The
economy's stupid.
It's always the economy. I love to use this line. It's becoming kind of cheesy to repeat this, but the economy is not only king, it's king, queen, and bishop. It is everything when Americans go to vote. Now, of course, I'm sitting here with you, of all people, at Bloomberg. The economy is light years away in terms of predicting where it'll be in November. We have so much to happen really from now till then. So it's not easy to predict who's going to be the winner on that topic, but that topic tends to be the most important topic. I want to caveat that, though. One thing that's really interesting that's happening, particularly with President Biden, is the conflict in the Middle East. And what we've picked up in our numbers and what we've seen on streets and protests and conversations within the Democratic Party is there really is a split with younger, more liberal Democrats on where they want to see President Biden on the issue specifically of how to handle the conflict, how to end the conflict. So that's an important factor, and it'll probably be with us for most of this year, I think, even if not through November. So it's an important topic to keep in mind, but it's probably not going to trump the economy.
Well, I'm glad you point that out, because young voters are part of the demographic groups that helped propel Biden to victory in 2020. There are others at play here as well, Black and Hispanic voters, for example. And yet we're also seeing that increasingly those voters are turning more away from President Biden. So how are you looking at different demographic groups here, young people being one, but others as well?
Absolutely. I think it's particularly interesting to look at young people and non-white Democrats. And what we see on those numbers, particularly when it comes to the Middle East conflict, is they have a very different perspective on what they want to see happen, how much they support the president's current policies. The economy is important to those voters as well, and they tend to have a very different perspective on when the economy is working or not working. Another thing that's really important is the most important problem, according to the American public, and I say this so many times, you know what I'm going to say, is poor government and poor leadership. And with younger and minority voters, that tends to actually be a very powerful and resounding issue for them. So the more that those voters continue to feel that they're dissatisfied with the process, that they're frustrated with how government operates, that they view government as the most important problem facing America, the less that's going to help an incumbent president, even if he is a Democrat.
I want to dig into this idea that you were mentioning about how the president is handling Israel and Palestine and how that's divisive among his Democratic base. We obviously had news today. Claudine Gay is resigning as president of Harvard. There's been a lot of backlash for testimony she gave in Congress last month, but also just on what has been happening on Harvard's campus in regard to anti-Semitism and this conflict, or at odds people seem to be feeling, of support for Israel on the one hand and support for Palestinians on the other. And that's not just true at Harvard. We've seen this, really across the country at this point. On the Israel and Hamas conflict in particular, what is the data, what is the polling telling you about where America is on this?
America's split. We did a poll, just asked people how they felt about the current fighting happening in Israel and Gaza specifically, and whether they support what's happening in terms of military operations. America's 50-45. 50% of Americans say they support what Israel's doing militarily. 45% say they don't, and that's actually pretty notable. I should say, even before this latest conflict ensued, this split among Democrats, particularly young and minority Democrats, on sympathies towards the Israelis versus the Palestinians has been growing. This is not something that sort of is taking place now because there's a war between Hamas and Israel. It really has been something that's building sustainably, at least for the past 7 to 8 years. So this conflict really triggered that tinder that was already there and building among liberals, and in particular, kind of the left wing of the Democratic Party.
And we continue to get news on it each and every day. Some other news that we're actually still waiting for today, Mohammed, relates to former President Trump and his myriad of legal issues. On the one hand, he's due to have a reply in the D.C. Circuit Court in regard to the presidential immunity case. On the other, we're waiting to see if they file for appeal in the Supreme Court of the Colorado decision to keep him off the ballot on the grounds of the 14th Amendment. What role do the courts play for the American voter? Do they trust the courts to be making these kind of decisions when it comes to a presidential candidate?
It's an amazing question. Basically, right now, the Supreme Court sits at a historic low in terms of public confidence. I should say, though, that most national institutions are sitting near or at record lows. So certainly the Supreme Court is not the arbiter of all of these cases. But aside from the courts and people's attitudes about them, what we've learned through the past 2 years is that basically very few of these legal developments have impacted President Trump's support with his base. So I don't expect a big shift in public opinion. I think what's really more critical to follow is whether or not some of these legal challenges develop into a situation where it's not really feasible for him to be a candidate in some of these contests. And I think that's really where things could change, but sort of waiting for supporters to peel off because he's facing yet another legal challenge. We just haven't seen support for that in the data all these past 2 years.
Yeah, so it may come down to whether or not he actually is on the ballot, whether that Colorado ruling holds up. Obviously, the Supreme Court is going to have to make some decisions in regard to Trump, many of them in all likelihood, but they're also going to be dealing with some other issues in this term in an election year, one of them being mifepristone, access to the abortion pill. We know the effect that the overturning of Roe v. Wade, of the Dobbs decision, the impact it had in 2022 in the midterms. If they were to make another ruling against abortion rights like that, do you think it would have the same potency in 2024? Are we still seeing abortion showing up as a galvanizing issue for the American voter?
We're still seeing abortion showing up. It's fascinating that you bring up mifepristone because like Roe v. Wade, mifepristone tends to be something that the majority of Americans support access to. So 6 in 10 Americans actually support people having access to that drug. If the court were to overthrow a decision or take a decision that takes that away, it'll probably have some kind of a negative impact on perceptions of the court with folks who share that view. Now, it's really rare to get 6 in 10 Americans to agree on anything when it comes to abortion. That's really what was unique about Roe v. Wade. Even though it was challenged in many ways, I went to law school hearing about how it was policy and not law. I mean, there have been a lot of people have criticized that decision, but it had public support. And I think that's what really drove the change in the public confidence in the Supreme Court. And we saw that in their assessments of the court itself. We saw that in an elevated number of people saying that abortion was a really critical issue for them when they vote. We saw that and continue to see that in the currently elevated rate of people who are identifying as pro-choice after that decision came out. So yes, it's still with us. And if there is another landmark decision, it'll bring it right back to the fore, and it's a potent issue.
All right, we only have about a minute left, Mohammed, but we've covered a lot of ground here in what 2024 may bring, how people are feeling. What is one other trend or something that you'll be focusing on in 2024?
I think for us, it'll be the election. It'll be what people are really tuning into for making that decision to cast their vote. One thing we really know right now is most Americans are still totally checked out. They're not focused on political news, unlike you and I, night and day. Yeah. I know, it hurts my feelings too. But as it gets closer to November, that number is going to rise, and we're going to start asking people, what are you bringing to mind when you cast that vote?
It's a good point. I feel like we've been living and breathing this for a year now, but really it's still early days. Mohammed Yunus joining us, Gallup's editor-in-chief. Thank you so much, as always, for being here. It's going to be a doozy of the year, guys, and we're going to have more on Congress's role in it coming up next. This is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:21 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow now in the red. That's a turnaround from our last update. 12-point drop right now in the Dow Jones Industrial Average, retreating from a record on this first trading day of the new year. The Dow now lower, little change, down less than 0.1%. S&P in the red by 34 points. The S&P now at 4735, a decline there of 0.7%. The Nasdaq 100 index is down 308 points, a drop there of 1.8%. The Nasdaq Composite Index down 1.8%. Russell 2000 Index of small cap shares down 0.7%. 10-year yield 3.93%, with a 2-year yielding 4.32%. Stocks and treasuries dropped as traders trim their bets on interest rate cuts. Spot gold down 0.1% now at $2,061 the ounce. Bitcoin up 3.4%, 45,098 on Bitcoin, and crude oil is now slumping by 1.8%. West Texas Intermediate crude now at $70.31 a barrel. Chevron will book fourth quarter charges of $3.5 to $4 billion, citing assets it sold in the Gulf of Mexico and policies in California, prompting the company to slash investments in that state. Oil stocks are trading higher. Chevron up 0.7%. Again, recapping, stocks are lower across the board. S&P 500 index down 34, a drop there of 0.7%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
Welcome back to the second hour of the fastest show in politics. I am indeed Kaylee Lines, though Joe Matthew is still out this week. And you know who's still out of office this week? Congress. They don't come back until next week. It's the 8th of January for the Senate, the 9th for the House, which means by the time both chambers are back in, we'll be 10 days out from a potential partial government shutdown, because that is where funding for a handful of government programs will expire, thanks to the continuing resolution that they passed in November. Remember, it split it up into two different groups. Well, the first expiration is January 19th, then followed by February 2nd. So there's not a lot of time to actually get these appropriation bills through. And House Speaker Mike Johnson, who's still fairly new to the job, has said he's not going to do any more short-term continuing resolutions. So it feels like there's just two options here. Either you get the bills passed in both chambers, which may be hard, or potentially part of the government shuts down. So let's get more on the odds of that now. Nathan Dean is joining us, Dad, as Joe fondly calls him. He is the senior U.S. policy analyst for us at Bloomberg Intelligence. He likes to run odds on all things congressional. So odds of a shutdown, at least partial, come January 19th, you think they're high?
70%. I mean, we would go actually higher, but we don't go higher until maybe next week will be 80%. But look, there's pretty much no reason why the Republicans and Speaker Mike Johnson wouldn't entertain a shutdown at this moment, because he's got so many members of his caucus that really want him to fight and to show that they're fighting for their beliefs here and so forth like that. And because the January 19th deadline is only 4 out of the 12 appropriation bills, and it's like Department of Agriculture, Transportation, HUD, for example, a partial shutdown of just those 4 appropriation bills and those agencies isn't going to warrant enough pressure to get Congress to come together and actually create a solution. Now you have the other issue of you have Ukraine aid, Israel aid, border security, all this stuff that's going on, plus 9 days of only being in town. I'm just not sure that's enough. The February 2nd deadline is probably the one that's more in line. But even then, we could see this potential shutdown going into February.
Well, yeah, February 2nd is when defense is in question. And we know that defense often is the thing that perhaps compels people most to solve their problems. Does a shutdown on January 19th, though, make it less likely that there's a shutdown on February 2nd, or would a shutdown just beget another shutdown, if that makes sense?
So I think I'd be open to the idea that it's a little bit less likely of a shutdown on February 2nd because of January 19th. Think of January 19th as being the warning shot across the bow. Look, folks, we already know this is coming. We've seen senators, I think it was Thune, who was making comments today, just, that knowing, look, we got to get our ducks in a row and act together, because things aren't going to move quickly when we get to Washington. So they've been negotiating on border security over the break. They have been negotiating about Ukraine. So, maybe all this comes together after the January 19th, and it's sort of a wake-up call. Now, on the same side, we've had former Speaker McCarthy leave Congress. His last day was, just a couple of days ago. George Santos has left Congress. That leaves Speaker Johnson with only 3 votes that he can afford to lose. And that's one of the tightest, thresholds we've seen in Washington, at least ever since I've been here. So can he come together, get this grandiose deal, get it past his naysayers in this Congress and so forth? Eventually they will, because on April 30th, they have a deadline that if we're under a continuing resolution, April 30th, there's a sequester. There we go. Sequester in the works. So where we're going with this is that there's going to be a lot of negative headlines. There's going to be a lot of scary movements. Eventually they will come to a deal. And the most important thing for what we're telling our clients is any government shutdown does have a minimal impact on both markets and companies like the defense contractors that are really interested in this.
Well, and that's what we continually hear, that this isn't the debt ceiling and a potential default, which could have been a cataclysmic event for markets and the economy. A shutdown is something that, frankly, we've seen and lived through before. You were talking about Mike Johnson. Are you running odds on him making it as Speaker through this entire year?
No. We try and stick to the company and the industry stuff and so forth. But we would also just say that for the government shutdown, if you're a trader and you're in the commodity space, the Department of Agriculture is probably going to stop putting out their reports on January 19th. So we could see commodity traders starting to see a little bit more impact before the equity traders in terms of the government shutdown, just because a lot of those reports that are useful just will be delayed.
Well, and we had that concern around economic data as well, around some critical Fed meetings. So maybe it's less critical if the Fed thinks, we're done here. We're going to start cutting in a few months. That's a completely separate conversation, Nathan. I won't make you weigh in on that. So as we're talking about all of these big picture things that Congress is going to have to figure out, literally the funding of the government, dealing with ongoing hot conflicts in the Middle East and Europe in terms of supplemental funding for Ukraine and Israel, how much room is left for other areas of focus, other legislative initiatives that maybe didn't actually make it through in 2023? Which ones stand a chance in 2024?
So, we still think that a crypto stablecoin bill can pass. We think that maybe not as a standalone measure, it could be attached to something. That's really what's key here is as we get close to this funding fight, as they get closer to resolution, keep an eye on a lot of those small but important bills like the crypto stablecoin bill. It's probably too early for the January-February scenario, but every lobbyist in town is going to try and attach a bill and use that funding bill as a vehicle to get to the president's desk. So we think crypto stablecoins can pass, but we're not exactly pretty bullish on anything else out there. A lot of it's going to be in the regulatory space. And the other thing we are telling our clients is there's something called the Congressional Review Act. And that is going to dictate a lot of regulatory actions in 2024. For those listeners who aren't aware of this, if you have a Republican White House, a House, and a Senate next year, anything that has been finalized by the regulators within 60 legislative days, which is probably around mid-June, anything that's finalized after that can be overturned. And we're beginning to hear whispers that regulators are trying to push things out even sooner, potentially even something like the Basel III Endgame, to get ahead of that deadline.
So glad you brought that up. That's my favorite subject to discuss with Nathan Dean here on Sound On, for those of you who listen and watch this program often. When we talk about the Basel III Endgame, essentially what we're talking about is higher capital requirements for the biggest banks. So think the likes of JP Morgan, for example, basically that they're going to have to put more money aside to keep in case things at some point go haywire. And what the banks say is that means they're going to give less money out. They're going to lend less, that it could have a detrimental effect on the economy. But the regulators, Nathan, say this is necessary to keep the banking system safe. So what's your expectation as to how this shakes out this year? Because obviously Michael Barr, the Fed's Vice Chair of Supervision, has gotten a great deal of pushback.
Yeah, so this is tricky. So like you said, the capital requirement increases around 20%. There is a lot of other provisions out there, like the operational risk provisions and the mortgage lending provisions and so forth, that a lot of people have concerns with. The problem is that the comment deadline for this is January 16th, right? And
so just a couple weeks away.
Just a couple weeks away. That's when the comment deadline is due. You'll see all the trade associations and all the banks start to opine and say, we don't like this. In their letters, you're also going to see them attack cost-benefit analysis and the process that the regulators have used to follow this. That is a signal that if you finalize this, we're going to sue you. But if the Fed is trying to get this out before that mid-June Congressional Review Act deadline, that's almost unheard of in how quickly of a turnaround that is. So I think the Fed is going to have a meeting sometime, non-public, get the staffers in a room type of meeting, sometime in February, March, and they're going to say, are we go, no go for this year? And if they think that they can change the proposal to get those moderate Democrats on board and also to placate the concerns that they're not going to get sued, if they can get that proposal out this year, they'll go ahead. If they don't, they're going to delay. We're still saying 60% chance that they get it out this year, but I'll just stress that that is a very thin line that the Fed is trying to play at the moment.
But the thinking would be if they don't get it out before the congressional review period, and you have potentially Republicans who are going to be in control of going forward, and Republicans have been some of the most vocal opponents against the Basel III endgame and against these higher capital requirements, that essentially they would come for you, basically, is the idea
Absolutely.
here.
I mean, if they put the rule out after June and the Republicans sweep all of Washington, the rule is very much at risk of being overturned. If they put it out and only the presidency goes to the Republicans, maybe the House stays with the Democrats, well, then you're going to get into this situation where maybe it's going to be more of a regulatory arbitrage, but I think the rule actually stands. But I think if you get to a point where the Fed says, you know what, we can't finalize it to placate the legal concerns, they're just going to delay it till 2025 and hope that Biden wins re-election.
Really fascinating stuff, and just speaks to how much the 2024 presidential race, and frankly down ballot races as well, impacts policy decisions all throughout Washington and beyond. Nathan Dean of Bloomberg Intelligence, the senior U.S. policy analyst for us here. As always, we appreciate your time. Now we want to get a check on world and national news. Here with that is Dan Schwartzman.
Thanks, Kaylee. As you've been hearing on Bloomberg Radio, Harvard University President Claudine Gay has confirmed to Harvard Crimson Report that she is resigning, which ends the shortest presidential tenure in the university's history. Gay served just 6 months and 2 days and had come under increased scrutiny after her December 5th congressional testimony on anti-Semitism on Harvard's campus, as well as multiple allegations of plagiarism in her academic work. Harvard says Provost Alan Garber will be named interim president. 6 people have now been reportedly killed in Beirut, Lebanon, in a suspected Israeli drone strike. The state-run Lebanese national news agency says an office belonging to Hamas was hit. The attack is the first on the Lebanese capital in nearly 2 decades. According to the terror organization, the deputy head of their Politburo, Saleh al-Aruri, was killed. Al-Aruri was also known as the mastermind behind the Palestinian terror group's armed wing in the West Bank and is the most senior Hamas member to be eliminated since the October 7th attack on Israel. Maersk says it's going to once again stop letting its container ships sail through the Red Sea as more vessels have come under attack from Iranian-backed Houthi militants. The attacks have continued despite the presence of an international coalition of Navy ships led by the U.S. meant to protect the transiting ships. Meanwhile, tensions in the region have now risen even higher as Iran has dispatched a warship to the Red Sea. Bloomberg opinion columnist Bobby Ghosh says the old Iranian ship would quickly be outmatched by the U.S. and allies, and its presence is largely symbolic at this point.
This is primarily signaling. It is there to reassure the Houthis that they are not alone, and it is there to signal to the rest of the world that Iran has a role to play.
That's Bloomberg opinion columnist Bobby Ghosh. The U.S. firing on Houthi rebels. 10 reportedly were killed as they had attacked a container ship transiting through the Red Sea. 12% of all global trade goes through that waterway. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want to with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Dan Schwartzman, and this is Bloomberg.
markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, on Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
It's 2:40 on Wall Street. We do check markets all day long here at Bloomberg. We have got the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ trading in the red. NASDAQ 100 index now down 315 points. That is a drop of 1.9%. NASDAQ 100 index having its biggest intraday drop in just about a month as the tech sector giants dubbed the Magnificent Seven falter. Right now, the Dow is down 38, drop there of 0.1%. S&P down 37, a decline there of 0.8%. So on this first trading day of the new year, a lot of red on the screen. NASDAQ again down 1.9%. 10-year yield 3.93% with a 2-year that's yielding 4.32%. Spot gold down $1.20 the ounce to $2,061, drop there of 0.1%. And West Texas Intermediate crude oil now down 1.6%, $70.54 a barrel. We do have Bitcoin rallying 3.2%. Bitcoin right around the 45,000 level, 45,018 on Bitcoin. As I mentioned, Apple lowered, down now by 4.2%, a downgrade for Apple at Barclays because of expectations of soft demand for its latest iPhone. Recapping, S&P down 38, drop there of 0.8%. I'm Charlie Pelleton. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
You're listening to Bloomberg Sound On with Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lines on Bloomberg Radio.
I am indeed Kaylee Lines. Joe Matthew has the day off today. Welcome back to the second hour of the fastest show in politics. We've talked a lot this hour about domestic politics, but we want to turn to geopolitical affairs now because there is a lot of news coming out of the Middle East. Today, Hamas said Israel killed one of its senior leaders in Beirut, a strike on Lebanese soil. That's the first time that has happened since 2006. Elsewhere, Iran has dispatched a warship to the Red Sea after the U.S. Navy downed multiple Houthi boats. The Houthis, of course, are backed by Iran. Add on to this the idea that Maersk is once again pausing all of its transit through the Red Sea because of these ongoing threats, and it just feels like the situation is not improving in the Middle East, to say the least. But we want to get a real read now on what exactly is happening. Nick Wadhams is joining me. He leads our U.S. national security coverage here at Bloomberg. So, Nick, if we just begin with Israel now striking into Lebanon, when there has been so much conversation around containing this conflict to just between Israel and Hamas, and frankly, just to the Gaza Strip, is this a signal of the broadening of the conflict that the U.S. has been so worried about?
Well, it's really interesting because there are a couple cross currents here. One is obviously it does seem to signal that Israel is taking its fight beyond where it had said it would before. And this is something we know had caused a lot of consternation and anxiety with the Biden administration. We had some reporting last week that President Biden had actually talked Israel out of opening a second front against Hezbollah in Lebanon because there has been rocket fire over that border. At the same time, they've also been encouraging Israel, to adopt a more strategic campaign, so less indiscriminate bombing of Gaza and more going after the leadership of Hamas, which they've said all along they want to do. Of course, in this case, the problem is that Hamas leadership happens to be in Lebanon. So the big question is, okay, what next? Lebanon has no interest really in getting involved in a wider war. We have some indication that Iran, despite a lot of the back and forth and belligerency, maybe does not want to either. So, but either way, I mean, this is a very significant escalation, and it does open the possibility of further Israeli targeting elsewhere in the region. But also, I mean, the Hezbollah, even though it's not Hezbollah, I mean, they're going to have to respond in some way.
Hezbollah being another Iranian proxy, just as the Houthis are. You just suggested that maybe Iran does want to avoid getting into more confrontation here with the U.S., for example. So then why send a warship into the Red Sea?
I mean, this is another way. A single Iranian warship cannot really counter technologically the allied forces that are there, but it feels like we're in a stage where there's a lot of gamesmanship and optics going on. I mean, with the U.S. attacking Houthi boats, killing Houthi rebels, that Iran felt in some way, listen, it has to project its own show of force. I think they recognize they would probably lose in a confrontation with the U.S. warship. But at the same time, the big risk here is of miscalculation. So I don't think you have either Iran or the U.S. actually wanting to get into a shooting war with each other. But what happens if they're both looking to play, to look strong, and then suddenly you have an actual incident, and then where does that lead? So a lot of, what the U.S. has done is sort of gone for a system of deterrence where they say, okay, we're putting our boats into the region, but we don't actually want them to get into conflict with anyone. It's possible Iran doing the same thing, but now, of course, you have the U.S. and Iran in very close quarters. It's a tough moment.
Absolutely. And to your point, the U.S. has been acting primarily defensively, assembling this maritime task force with other countries to try to protect merchant vessels that are going through these waterways. And yet you're seeing that these big container shippers like Maersk, for example, don't seem to think that that is enough to adequately ensure their safety. They're just not going to use these waterways. And as a result, you could see some serious disruption to global trade, which is where the offense question comes in. If really what is necessary to secure this is outright strikes against the Houthis in Yemen. Does the presence of an Iranian warship change that risk calculation for the U.S. potentially?
I think this is still very much a live debate. I mean, I think it is still really on the table, the possibility of strikes against the Houthis. I mean, part of Iran's strategy has been to, it's like, okay, we know they're funding the Houthis. We know in some ways they're providing intelligence, but I don't want to try to get into their heads, but I don't think they would want to be seen fighting alongside the Houthis. But what it does do is create real questions about this patrol system, this coalition in the Red Sea. What they've said is, listen, think of this as like the highway patrol. We're not going to stop every person speeding down I-95, but putting that police cruiser on an exit or a turnoff is going to provide the deterrent effect to keep everybody in line. The indication now is that this sort of highway patrol system for the Red Sea, it's early days, but it's not really working yet. I mean, you obviously Maersk again cutting back, everybody going around the southern tip of Africa. So it's going to provoke the question, okay, what now? Like, we can do defense. Do we need to go on offense? I think the Iranian warship complicates matters a little bit, but still very much a live debate. And we know there are voices within the administration saying, listen, we got to go after these guys at the source.
Well, and it's not just voices within the U.S. administration that matter here, right? It's not a U.S. independent decision. There are dozens, or at least well over a dozen countries involved in this maritime task force. The U.S. also has key allies in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, whose feelings on the matter have to be taken into account. So how does all of that factor in?
Well, I think what you would see is if there is a military strike, and again, we have no indication that this is happening at any time immediately, but what you would see would be a very clear effort to differentiate the coalition and those countries, which have already been quite ambivalent about even having, there's some countries that are part of that coalition that don't even want their names to be known because they're worried about getting caught up in this. So there are huge sensitivities there versus, okay, the U.S. is going to do these strikes, separate from that. Obviously, we know there's a lot of diplomacy going on with the Saudis who want to quiet down. They want a ceasefire with the Houthis. They want out of their war with the Houthis. So they're going to have to take that into account. But, when you get down to the issue of global trade and you have the Houthis actually attacking these boats, the administration may just feel ultimately that they have no choice but to do it.
Yeah, a very difficult calculation for the administration. And on the subject of the Biden administration, we have just over a minute left here, Nick. They've come under scrutiny in recent days for essentially going around Congress to provide weapons to Israel. Can you just shed some light on that?
Well, I mean, what the administration has said very clearly is, listen, we may have concerns about what Israel is doing in Gaza, the civilian death toll, but we have your back, and they are going to do everything they can to make sure that Israel has the weapons it needs. Congress can put up a little bit of a fight. Congress is also away. They're not back from Christmas yet. The administration decides, okay, we need this money now. Yes, there's a lot of wrangling in Congress, but ultimately they know bipartisan support for help with the defense of Israel is very, very high. So this is one of those things, I think, hey, are you guys really going to bust us on a foot fault? The answer is no.
All right, Nick Wadhams, the head of our U.S. national security team here at Bloomberg, thank you so much. Certainly something we have to keep an eye on. Again, there are many things that are happening that seem like escalatory, but of course we just have to continue and deal with the information that we know. as we know it. We're going to have a little bit more coming up for you here on Sound On, so stick with us. This is Bloomberg.